Hello, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram, which are all in the description box. Don't forget you can support me on Locals, Buy Me a Coffee, and Subscribe Star, also all in the description box. Logos and I will get to super chats first and any other chats near the end as time allows and as they're related to the content. Just like last week, we're going to mix it up a little bit by watching videos and commenting on them that other people wrote and did about Moldbug. So tonight we have Oren McIntyre, Moldbug, and the system. So if you're ready to go, Logos, you can go ahead and start the video.
Okie dokie.
Curtis Yarvin has become well known for a concept called the cathedral, a phrase he coined to describe the decentralized consensus-making apparatus that tends to inform the decisions made by Western governments. In his latest massive essay, Yarvin has expanded that concept, explaining the many different parts that make up what he calls the system. Yarvin's ability to analyze and explain the nature of power has always been the most interesting parts of his writing. So we'll be diving into his explanation of the system today to better understand how power flows and is used inside the United States and the many other Western countries that it influences. Yarvin begins by explaining that Americans are very used to the idea of a written down physical constitution. They've been trained to treat this constitution as some kind of religious revealed truth handed down from on high. It's inscribed in stone and should almost never be changed. Americans are taught that the Constitution is a constant, even though the world may shift around it. As long as the country continues to adhere to these founding words, things will be okay. But of course, this is not how governance actually works. As the country grows and changes, and as their leaders push the country in different directions, the way the country is governed and the way that it's written down in the Constitution that it's supposed to be governed start to change over time. We like to think that these changes are updates made to the Constitution through amendments, but the majority of changes in the way that the country runs are not formalized, and the gap between the way the country is supposed to be run and the way the country is actually run gets wider and wider.
Okay, go ahead.
And so we end up in a scenario where there's
So, yeah, the one thing here that is this, again, this is Oren's take on Moldbug, but this is the problem that I see, right? The argument's going to then be the Constitution has always been a farce and that it doesn't really describe what's really going on. But you see, the changes that are sort of just assumed to be these natural things, as the changes and gets bigger, blah, blah, blah. No, but the two changes that really affect our understanding of the Constitution that it was not able to deal with is one, the rise of private power after the American Civil War, and two, the rise of digital technology after 2007. So it's basically Moldbug attacking the Constitution for doing something that it was never intended to do, deal with these new power structures. And the real problem is the amendment process wasn't used properly to deal with them.
Yeah, what I got gained out of that is what it seems that Oren likes about Moldbug is his analysis of power dynamics. And so going forward, when we look at Moldbug, I think one question we can ask is when he's analyzing power, does he really have a good monopoly on the narrative he's using to analyze power? Because if there are sources we can use to talk about that without also falling into his mistakes, that might be helpful to people.
Right. And I guess the other thing I want to add before we start the video again is given that this is the guy that thinks that the New York Times wields more power than tech companies or the government, or than corporations, I mean. Yeah, I don't think we can take that too seriously. Go ahead.
There's basically a founding myth about the way that the organs of power inside the United States are supposed to function, and then there's an actual way that the organs of power function. It doesn't mean that there are two sets of organs. There are only one set of organs, but there are two explanations, one which is real and one which is mythological. Yarvin calls the story about how power originally was supposed to function inside the United States the Republic, and calls the explanation of how power actually functions inside the country the system. Under the Republic, the United States is basically an elected monarchy. But over time, as the way power actually functions inside the United States has drifted away from that story of the Republic, the United States has instead adopted the structure of an oligarchy. Now, there are...
Sorry, I'm muted. Okay, I want to pause it here for a second. The president was supposed to have less power under the Constitution than they currently have now.
Yes.
Like, when was the last time, and Moldbug would have even known this in 2007, right? When was the last time you had Congress pulling the purse strings to determine whether or not we can go to war?
A long time ago. Probably, I mean, the last time there was a congressional declaration of war was World War II.
Yeah. So, I mean, this idea that the president has been losing less power, has been losing more power as time goes on, is crazy. The office of the presidency has been given more and more and more leeway, to the point where people are just questioning like what kinds of executive orders they're going to be doing to try to circumvent Congress. And now basically what's happened is you have a president in battle with a court system. And the question is the court going to let the president get away with this or that executive order or not, because Congress has become gridlocked and whatever. Now, if you want to make the argument that, like, well, okay, the president isn't really declaring the policy, whether we go to war or whatever, somebody else is, that's even back in the monarchy days, there was always the power behind the throne. There was the councils, there was the cardinals, there was all sorts of people that would speak into the ears of the king to drive them to war and do all sorts of crazy stuff. I mean, even back during when the British monarchy was stronger, you had like the East India Company and stuff like this going on. Like, this isn't really new, so I'm having trouble figuring out like what's going on here.
Well, Logos is confused. I think a lot of us are confused. But okay, not only is it not new, it's not true. The president, as the chief executive, was supposed to have very little power under what Moldbug calls the Republic. Only now do we have the imperial presidency, which is, the system.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are many different types of oligarchy, of course. You can have a military oligarchy, you can have a mercantile oligarchy, but Yarvin identifies our oligarchy as a clerical oligarchy. Now, you could call a clerical oligarchy a theocracy,
Okay,
but
hold on,
Yarvin
pause it.
warns that this...
That is so BS. I mean, we know it's a financial oligarchy. Who runs everything?
Exactly.
Who are the clerics? Oh, I'm sorry. It's the New York Times.
Well, basically, I think Moldbug's argument is going to be here that it's academia. So what happens is academia is the new priestly class. They create activists. Activists go work for the New York Times, and so the priestly class kind of gets its tendrils into all these institutions. And this gets into what James Lindsay and people like them are talking about now, where you have like ESG. So yeah, financial institutions run everything, but note that ESG, Klaus Schwab, Z-Bugs, all this stuff is being pushed. It's being pushed from somewhere. Moldbug would argue that the academy is really driving even the financial institutions.
Yeah, but the thing is, that's got it backwards. Who's funding this research? Who funded Kinsey's research? Corporations.
That's true.
So all of this research that has led to these activists on the ground was funded by, wait for it, the corporations.
Yep. So at best, you have this kind of incestuous relationship where corporations, through grants, through other methods, kind of set the tonal stage for which academic research will and will not see print. And then that research will then set the stage for which kind of faculty will fill that void and do the research, which then sets the stage for the next class of people that will study under those PhDs performing that research. That class will then go work for the corporations, giving this kind of self-fulfilling loop.
Well, not only that, one of the things that we've talked about before in other contexts in private is that when schools, whether they be middle schools, high schools, colleges, or universities, get grants from corporations to update their supplies with, say, computers, there's all sorts of strings attached as to what they have to teach.
True, and that's even true for the federal government as well. I mean, look at Biden's thing with lunches, right? School lunch funding is going to be tied to schools meeting a particular interpretation of Title IX involving like trans students and things like that. If you look at the motivation behind those government grants, it's also corporately involved, guaranteed. I mean, how much of this trans stuff do the pharmaceutical companies and the medical industrial complex, how much of a role are they playing in this huge thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Can be a trap because our Western concept of a theocracy always involves a metaphysical God and a holy book and a central church structure. But our current progressive oligarchy does not contain these things. Instead of making claims that tend to be mystical and supernatural, our clerics tend to make claims that are physical and philosophical. Either way, the result is the same. To make it look like an abstraction is ruling, whether that abstraction be the gods, or justice, or freedom, or liberty, or equality, it doesn't really matter. One of the core strengths of the clerical oligarchy is the ability to make it look like no one actually rules. What rules is the abstraction, and so one person can never truly be held to account. The abstraction is always good. The abstraction is always something to work towards. If there's ever a failure in the system, it's never the abstraction's fault. It's just a failure to realize the beauty of the abstraction.
Okay, go ahead.
And because the source of their...
So the idea that nobody's responsible, there's a much deeper reality here. So there's a documentary you can find online called On Technique, which is an interview with Jacques Ellul himself. It's in French, but there's English subtitles. And he opens up with this discussion about, I always forget who the mid-20th century German on trial, the one with the banality of evil with Hannah Arendt. I forget the guy.
Kafka?
No, not Kafka. I want to say Heydrich, but it's not Heydrich either. That guy, the one that she was referring to when she was talking about the trial. The idea that no one's responsible for a technical process, and the way what Ellul says is the reason why otherwise moral people can be pigeonholed into these things where they do this is because you view the whole thing as a process and you're a technician at one part, so you don't bother to think about the whole thing, whether it's good or bad, whether you should do it or you shouldn't do it. You're just tasked with this one thing, and in his case, this guy was the trains. Let's see. I'll look this up. Hold on. Banality of, because I always forget.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you were talking about the book The Trial.
Eichmann. There we go.
Yeah, Eichmann. Yeah.
Yeah. And so what he's saying is that it's okay. Yes, but the thing is, the fact that the quote no one's responsible because quote everybody's responsible. It isn't the result of some sort of like progressive cabal. It's the necessary result of a technical society. You'd find it in any modern technical society, whatever their value system is. That's the mode of explanation for why no one's responsible.
Yeah, and for a good result of this, I mean, just look at the financial recession that happened in 2010, right? You would think that the banks putting all this, bundling all these things into toxic mortgages and all this stuff would have like this, there'd be some culprits there for the shady stuff that was going on, right? But if you look into all of it, everybody's blaming somebody else, right? So you've got the people that decided to bundle the packages. They were talking to certain statisticians or using certain techniques. And the statisticians, well, I'd say the economist statisticians, the financier statisticians, because actual statisticians don't like these people. They were saying, well, we use these techniques and we thought it was good. And based on the government's willingness to bail out like homeowners and do all these things during downturns, we didn't think the mortgage crisis would have got so bad. So our past data, given how the government acted, would have thought that, things would have been bailed out and things would have been fine if they went shaky. So it seemed to us to be a sure bet, for example, right? But then you look at some of the techniques used, and statisticians are like, well, these weren't good. And then like every part of the system, if you look at the documentation of it, was blaming so many different other parts of the system. The financial system could blame the government acting inconsistently with how it handled economic downturns and people being unable to pay their mortgages. The government blame the financial sector for not following for advocating to weaken some of the rules they would have had to follow to not put things in these risky things and so on. You don't have to look at progressivism. Like this financial collapse stuff started happening long before the ascendancy of some of these progressive institutions, and it was the same thing that you and Jacques Ellul were talking about, where this thing has so many moving parts. All the parts can reliably blame the other ones.
Yep.
Theoretical power is really beyond assault. That means that the clerical oligarchy is always in a very stable position of power. From here, Moldbug begins to lay out the skeleton of the system and explains how the apparatus of the clerical oligarchy differs from the way we've been taught that power in the country works since we were young. We will begin from the bottom with the least powerful of the 5 organs of the system, called the castle. The castle contains the armed might of the United States. This, of course, includes the military and often many law enforcement organizations. While military might traditionally be a place where power can be contested, inside the system, the castle is actually the most well-controlled of all of the organs of power. The divine right of civilian power to rule over the military is ingrained in all Americans from a very young age. And at this point, almost no military commander even thinks about blinking without looking up to their civilian leadership for guidance. An incredibly short leash is kept on the military, and no power is allowed to leak out of this organ of the system. This is, of course, meant to make sure that there will never be a military coup, especially due to the fact that people in the cathedral would be so unable to actually contest along these lines. It is necessary for the power of the military to be subjugated at every turn, and so it is. As we move up, we see the next organ of power inside the system, which is called the factory. The factory contains all the forces of capitalism. It is all the power of industry and corporations. While what seems like large amounts of power may be accumulated inside different corporations in the factory, those corporations are always in a state of war with each other and are required to follow the rules of engagement in that war set out by higher powers inside the system. While we will at times see power leak out of the factory and influence other parts of the system, that power is almost always being used to simply increase profits and feed back into power at the level of the factory. Liberals will often look at the power leaking out of the factory, seeing it influence politicians and societal decisions, and identify that corruption as the actual core problem with society. But this is a mistake. Whatever the terrible decisions of corporate titans, in the end, those values that are informing those decisions are not coming from the factory level. They are coming up higher inside the system, and we'll talk about the levels they come from in a moment.
Okay.
Our next organ of power inside the...
No, this was okay about a year ago, I think. So this is clearly absurd. No, most of these corporations are all conglomerated. BlackRock owns like almost all of them. They're just shells. Right, Logos?
Well, right, which is why the argument is it's not the corporations as such that have all the power.
Yeah.
It's the people that own the corporations.
Yeah, but who owns them? It's the money power. It's not the people that work at the New York Times or the people that work in like Yale.
Well, they think the ESG people report to those people. That's going to be the argument.
Well, that's going to be the argument, right? But like
right.
the old money, the DuPonts, the Carnegies, the Fords, they run everything.
Yeah.
But the thing is, who funded all of this progressive research way back in the day. They did.
Yeah.
They did. Remember, go back to 1910, 1920, 1930. That whole window, it was the Carnegies, the Fords, the Rockefellers that were funding all this.
Mm-hmm.
And now it kind of has a life of its own, where it just sort of works on its own. But those guys are they've so conglomerated that they don't have to be the ones on the floor now, quote, running the factory. They've already made their trillions of dollars and have become BlackRock.
Yeah.
I mean, they already won. That's the thing, right? That's the issue here. And again, this is the ultimate flaw of Moldbug's analysis. It's what is, not what ought to be. Well, none of this is written in tablets of stone. It didn't exist 200 years ago. So why does it exist now? And
well, true. And what I find interesting is the brain. We'll get to this, but the brain is the top of the cathedral. It's the most powerful one, right? Now, what determines like the brain could have all sorts of values, right? The brain could have any values it wants. What determines what values the brain has?
that's a good question. But the other thing is these progressive values that of course Moldbug objects to, and that have become totally predominant in society, are all corporate funded. I mean, the entire sexual revolution, as I've discussed elsewhere, was funded by the Rockefellers backing Kinsey up. Yep. And so, or it's deep state, right? So like the CIA, and all that stuff, like with the drugs, as Timothy Leary said. But, again, well, I guess if you're going to take the Elulian position even deeper, the real hot brain is the computer, the technicians that make everything work for the good of the machine. But that's a little bit even deeper. But the point is, though, to put the factory there at number 4 is ridiculous. That's insane.
Yeah, for me, I would not have this as a hierarchy. I would have this as a circle where you have different things influencing each other.
Fair enough.
The system is called the Bureau. The Bureau can often seem incredibly powerful because, of course, the other organs of power below it are required to obey its dictates. The Bureau, as its name implies, is the ever-present bureaucracy, constantly keeping an eye on everything inside our civilization. The Bureau's job is to make sure that the rules are always being followed. It sets the rules, it executes the rules, it makes sure that the mechanisms required to make the rules function and to monitor the following of the rules are in place. These are the people who are in charge of making sure that every crushing little specific regulation is followed to the letter all over the country. Your average talk radio conservative thinks that this is where power is actually the problem. They think that the Bureau is actually the source of the rot inside the country, but this too is also a mistake. While the Bureau does have significant power and it does dictate to so many people what they will do with their lives, it does not originate these ideas. The rules that it creates are always following a structure laid out by an organ of power that is one step higher in the system. That organ of power that sits at the top of the structure is, of course, the one that we are already more familiar with from Yarvin's previous work, that is the cathedral. But Yarvin doesn't just place the cathedral at the head of the system, he also breaks down further the different divisions inside this decentralized clerical oligarchy, which actually holds the power inside the United States. At the beginning of the cathedral, we see the brain. The brain is the place where truth is actually created, where it's actually produced. The brain is made up of the college professors, the elite journalists, and the serious artists who put out the cultural ideas that the rest of the system and all of our country eventually adopts. The voice produces true stories, which are the way that different individuals and different organizations inside the system absorb these truths that are handed down from the brain. The conversation is where the elites have their discussions. Yarvin points out a truth that we have discussed many times on this channel, which is that the elites are those that truly set the culture of any given society. We can see from the diagram that in each step, prestige is flowing from one section of the cathedral to another, granting it legitimacy and power. And by adopting the ideas and the stories of the brain and the voice, the conversation and the elites contained inside it are making those ideas trendy and fashionable and palatable to the masses further down the road. The foundation's function inside the cathedral is to lend the power of funding. It's the economic power that pushes these ideas out into the different organs of the system and into the minds and hearts of those that live under the regime. And then, of course, the school is the educational system, which takes these ideas that have been created by the brain and have been popularized and made fashionable by the conversation and makes sure that the average citizen is indoctrinated in them for at least a good 10 to 15 years before being released into society. The dream is a complicated and less fleshed out concept that I could probably spend a whole video on, and I may end up doing that sometime in the near future. Now we'll go ahead and look at that fifth and final.
Wow, that is, I don't even know where to start at that hot mess. I mean, first of all, a lot of this edgy culture stuff was the CIA, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, founded in 1950, was where a lot of this, 1950, notice that's like what, the quote unquote 60s, I think starts like in 62, 63, well before then. And they are getting, this core where they then start to subvert communism, but also used to subvert and change America. There was lots of investigations in the 50s of nonprofits, again, back to the Carnegies and the Fords, and their connection to these subversive ideas. I mean, for example, in the video that I did, the roundtable I did a couple months ago with Prudentialists, we talked about China and the rise of communism and how it was in fact supported by a think tank that was Rockefeller backed that gave really bad advice to FDR and Truman in handling China in order to allow it to turn red. And so, again, all of these, the idea that a bunch of like bohemian poets are like the brain of this whole system is delusional. Like, what do you have to believe that?
Right. I mean, the initial question is, where do these brain people get their ideas?
Well, not only that, they don't have intrinsic power. Like, you go to a university, they don't have money. These people are often, stuck in a web of debt. They can't snap their fingers and buy out a small country like, say, Carnegie could.
Well, yeah, it's not about real power. It's about cultural influence. What they're saying. So basically, the entire argument, top down, goes something like this: artists, John Lennon's Imagine, for example, Pink's A Million Dreams. Whatever you want to do, right? This globalist open border stuff. It's produced by artists, and these artists, these academics, Slavoj Žižek, I don't think he's one of them necessarily, but you get the idea. These academics, so to speak, like the ones that tried to debate Jordan Peterson or whoever. This whole network of artists, journalists, academics set the cultural tone. Setting the cultural tone then shifts the polls. The polls then shift political opinion, right? The famous quote, Hillary Clinton was against gay marriage before she was for it. The polls changed, basically. They shift the polls. The polls shift political opinion. And then the politicians, the bureau, do stuff. Now, if they can shift the right political opinion, the politicians will regulate the factory toward political ends. So like ESG would be a perfect example of that. So it's not just enough that you have like work and safety regulations from the government. In order to get financial money from ESG sanctioned by the government, this is a cartel or regulated monopoly, BlackRock and all them, you now have to do these extra ESG things into your company. And so this is like an informal regulation on the company. And then then you have all these extra regulations in the military. So, for example, look at that trans admiral or something that's in the military right now, the goofy stuff going on. So that's basically how the story is being told, but it's almost like he has this view that the brain has these ideas in a vacuum. They just come up with them, and society just jumps.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's two things here that are utterly ridiculous. So first of all, let's briefly look at a couple excerpts from Pink Floyd's "The Machine."
Right.
It's "Where have you been? It's all right. We know where you've been." Okay. Well, who's the we? Because he's singing about the artist, right? The artist is the one being asked the question.
Right.
And then the other one is, "What did you dream? It's all right. We told you what to dream." Yes. Who told them what to dream?
Right.
People don't act in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Now
that's a component that's missing.
Yeah. The other thing is we have the Strawberry Statement, Notes of College by James Coonan, who was a radical, 1969. And I quote from page 112, "We were also offered ESSO, Rockefeller money. They wanted to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move to the left." It's all Rockefeller. It all goes back to these megacorps. Like, why can't Moldbug see this? It's all over the place.
Well, it's because he's a libertarian, and libertarians are just unable to see this because they're libertarians.
There you go. Yeah, but that's the point. This is idiotic. These people only have power because they're propped up. I'll give you an example. Look at the TERFs. They don't have power now. 20 years ago, they
used to.
They wielded a big stick, but not anymore. So clearly they weren't the ones that had the power. They had it loaned to them by somebody else.
Right. And that's a really good example because some of the big academics that were like the front line of feminist movements then are still fairly big academics now. Camille Paglia and all them, right? The radical feminists of the time, that they're still around. But guess what? Society hasn't privileged them now. But if they're the brain, if the academics, the brain, are where this stuff is produced, we now have a problem because the same people in the span of their entire lives can be in the brain or not in the brain. Well, that means there's something even higher than the brain or more fundamental to the brain deciding which academics are going to be in the brain, and if academics are going to be in the brain, what they're going to think.
Bingo. Yeah, I mean, yeah. All right.
Final organ of power for the system called the show. You'll notice that the show is separate from the rest of the organization because it works differently. The show is that mythological story about how the old republic used to run before our clerical oligarchy took over with the system. While the system holds all of the current power, maintaining the show, maintaining the story of how power is in theory supposed to work is essential to its continued success. Because, of course, our clerical oligarchy never wants you to actually be able to locate its power. One of the keys to its stability is its continued ability to never be held accountable. And the show's primary function is to continue to draw heat away from that clerical oligarchy and towards the system that we all believed for so long was actually the way power works inside the United States. By continuing to indoctrinate the population into believing that our system currently functions in the same way the Republic was supposed to function at the founding of the country, it is able to draw.
Yeah, this is so insanely delusional. Even in 2007, the very people he's talking about, the academics, okay, because I was in college in 2007, nobody was saying this. They were saying that the system was flawed. It was built by privileged white slaveholders, and it had to be dismantled. What is Moldbug talking about?
For which part? Sorry.
Well, the last part, the Republic, the show. They're not trying to get us to believe that, oh, this is the way it worked in George Washington's day. I remember growing up in college, they were saying, no, that was bad. We got to tear it down and have democracy.
Yeah, he's not talking about college. When he's talking about the show, he's talking about, let's say, congressional gridlock. Congressional gridlock is itself a feature of the system on Moldbug's view, in the sense that if, let's say, people want certain regulations on the corporations, or they want regulations on abortion or some other social issue, and congressional gridlock is stopping it. Well, the entire point of the show is that the gridlock itself is the show. It's meant to give the illusion that the gridlock is happening because that's the way the system was designed, but really a gridlock's happening because the forces that be are calling for a gridlock. Basically, they have the lobby money, they choose which politicians get elected, and so on. And so Congress, the CNN, the news about Congress, political debates, these bills, these are kind of like when you're playing a trick, right? It's like don't watch what the other hand's doing, right? Congress is the hand that you want to get the other person to watch, and not the hand you don't want to get them to watch. So while Congress is debating about McCarthy or whatever it's doing, the CIA is the other hand doing all the stuff you were talking about.
Right. So two things here with regards to that. Not a deliberate conspiracy. Wow. BS. Like that is so. I don't know what to say at that point. I've already talked about the conspiracy. The other thing is, okay, let's say this gridlock is a show. Who's got the money? Who's the lobbyists? Corporations, the deep state.
Yep.
Like it's not the brain. Who the heck is? It's not the brain going over there, and not some college professor saying, "Hey guys, I want you to choke up Congress." What? They're not doing that.
No. It's no. These are parallel. The brain isn't influencing the show. So what's going on is the show is keeping the government gummed up. Because the government's gummed up and not operating the way it's supposed to work, something's still going to wield power. So you have executive orders. You have financial companies acting in private in lieu of congressional law. You have things like that. It's the brain's radicals and influencers that enter newspaper articles, executive branches, corporate offices, financial institutions, and they're the ones that push the agenda behind the scenes while the government, who's supposed to be making the laws, is perpetually gummed up, is basically the argument.
Okay, but I guess then it just goes back to where we started. Where do these ideas come from?
Correct.
They come
Yes.
from, they're funded by Carnegie, Ford, and Rockefeller. And we have the money trail. I mean, it's all been recorded elsewhere.
Right.
Follow the money. And so, and then of course, who does the hiring? The corporations. These people then get hired because they've been groomed for the position. Oh, you've accepted all the right thing that we've been feeding you over the last 20 years. You're good for a management position.
Right.
Draw populist energy away from the actual rulers of the country, the clerical oligarchy inside the system. All of our politicians are functionally part of the show. The point of the politicians is to serve as a scapegoat for any failures created by the system itself. Because the elected politicians have almost no power to actually influence long-term the decisions of the system, they serve as the perfect decoys. These people are fully invested in this narrative, to be sure. Much like the gladiators of old, the swords are sharp and the stakes can be incredibly high, but of course this just lends credibility and believability to the show. In the end, every politician, everyone participating in the show is 100% expendable. Those people are never actually essential to the running of the system. They never actually sit at the head of the clerical oligarchy. At any time, members of the show can be sacrificed. All blame can be placed on them. And they, of course, are keeping the oligarchy from ever actually being held accountable for any of its decisions, any of the directions it is taking the United States or the Western world at large at this point.
Okay, I want to pause it real quick because, this exact narrative of them being expendable to the brain, I can see why he might think that. There was a congressperson in the 2000s, I think it was around 2012 to 2014, I could be wrong, left-wing darling, basically, for a long while, right? But then, I don't know exactly what he did or what the conspiracy theory is on him, but a whole bunch of women, started, I think his name was Al Franken. Yeah, I think it was Al Franken.
Al Franken, yeah, maybe.
Yeah, and then he got Me Too'd, all of a sudden, and his career was just, instantly over. So I think this is what he means by the people in the show: reporters, politicians, whatever, the people on the front lines in CNN. Cuomo, Fredo, whatever that guy's name is, got canned from CNN's working at his own place. That's the way in which they're expendable. So their careers are on the line based on what they do and how they predict election results and blah 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 blah, how they do the song and dance. And they believe the sparring matches they get into with each other But when their number is up, they'll get let go and they'll be replaced with some other figurehead who'll do the same job, basically.
Right, but if we're going to use that argument, though, that holds true of academics all the time.
Exactly. That's another good. That's what he said about Camille Paglia, for example, right?
Yeah.
She was in the brain. Now she's not in the brain.
Well, not only that. What about the COOF? All of these, like, scientists are now getting thrown out because they're contradicting Bill Gates.
Yeah, it's a good point.
That happened too. I mean, think of what was it, Malone?
Malone. Who's the cardiologist guy that I've seen a lot of? Yeah, Malone's the RNA guy, and there's the cardiologist that was one of the most, I guess published medical researchers in the field, and now he's on everybody's crap list. Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, somebody is deciding who is in the brain in the first place.
Yeah, and guess what? It's not the university professors.
And it's not the professors. It's not
because they're the ones getting thrown out.
They are getting thrown out. You have people getting thrown out, even circumventing like tenure boards and stuff like that. There's one that was like in Berkeley at the start of the COOF, and he was like on the medical ethics board, and he got into like hot water. I don't know if he ended up getting fired or like indefinitely suspended or what because of his hesitancy to this whole thing. So like, yeah, something is even going over the head of the academy to determine what.
Well, think of the Weinstein brothers.
Yeah, good point.
All of these people were superstars up until 2017, 18, 19, and 20.
Yeah.
And so the idea that they're the ones running the show and then firing themselves, this is delusional.
It doesn't pass a smell test.
This proves, I think, to me more than ever, that Moldbug was a plant to spread disinformation. What this does is it deflects attention from the people who are calling the shots. BlackRock, the people that made all the money over 200 years and have conglomerated into this. Vanguard is the other one. And yeah, well, we can't talk about them. I mean, they're only level 4 on this chart, bro. Like, look, finally Moldbug has to admit that they have influence. He wasn't even admitting that back in 2007.
Yeah, I mean, from what we've read, he seemed to be downplaying it quite a bit, to the extent that he was even wondering, like, he was trying to paint this narrative where one day, for no reason at all, a bunch of authoritarian progressive policies came to power, completely ignoring like the corporate malfeasance that like spawned the populist backlash to the whole thing in the first place. Yeah.
Yep.
The show itself wields no real power, but the show is key to making sure that those who are in power can stay in power. It is a key feature granting stability to the system. Armed with a better understanding of how the show works and how the system in general functions, hopefully we are able to better understand our place inside it and what steps we need to take next when confronting the societal problems produced by a corrupt and failing cathedral. Thanks for watching, guys. As always, if you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and click like.
Okay, that's that.
All I have to say is this just convinces me more than ever that everything we've been saying about Moldbug is true. Now, two things. Oren has done a good job at somehow organizing the unorganizable, so I'll give him that, right? I mean, as far as I can tell, there's nothing in Moldbug to organize, so we'll give that to Oren there. But having done so, and this is someone who's sympathetic to Moldbug, so we can consider this a steel man. This is complete trash. And again, this was just last year, so many of the people we're talking about logos in the academy were already thrown out.
Yeah.
They're expendable. This is ridiculous. And you know who else is expendable? U.S. soldiers. How many died in the war on terror? I mean, it's like, how many have committed suicide? I mean, suicide rates are 4 times higher. So for the actual battlefield deaths versus those deaths are 4 times higher.
Yeah, and that's something even Moldbug agreed with, right? Because the castle, the military stuff, was the lowest rung of the. So I think we all agree there. I mean, even Veblen talked about this, that the military was just kind of like this neutral structure that was ripe for subversion, either by corporate forces. So there's two things. There's either going to be like a traditional backlash. Veblen thought this was in the early 1900s, by the way, when he was talking about this. He said that the military will be subsumed by basically corporate friendly forces or some kind of like Spartan kind of like traditionalism. and the military was going to be at a major crossroads. And that's really, really interesting because that's where we are right now. Actually, he was thinking 100 years in the future, because if you look at what's going on in the military, you've got the trans stuff, the female fighter pilots, the pregnant female fighter pilot stuff, the crazy stuff going on in the military. A whole bunch of ex-military people being like, "Yep, I'm jumping ship," and they're just not renewing their contracts and saying, "I'm glad I got out when I did." Like, I've been seeing this on Twitter like over the past couple of days, because there's like a massive divergence in values. The more the military kind of starts looking like a woke corporation, the more the people that were courted by the military in the first place, right? Because who does the military court to join it overall? Uh, Probably Southern a lot of the time, traditional, masculine, kind of like good old boys that want to, like, serve the country or whatever, right? And if you court these people to join the military and they turn into a woke corporation, it juxtaposes the values like instantly. And like now you're gonna see like hard reactions and stuff from all these people leaving it. They probably wouldn't go in or be happy unless it took like a really hard turn away. Like, you have to really convince them. And that's the kind of stuff that Veblen was talking about. So yeah, the military is a bottom rung on this. It's kind of figuring out how it's going to react to the systems above it. But yeah, I mean, the fundamental question is, how does a brain get its contents? Basically, what determines what's inside the brain in the first place is the number one question this thing doesn't answer.
Well, and of course, we know it's corporations for two reasons. One, all the strings attached to new computers, new equipment, all of that stuff. So they determine what you teach by giving you this new equipment. And so that's one way they do it. And then two, the other way they do it is funding these nonprofits like the Kinsey Institute to then start seeding everything with these ideas. And then you could also say the deep state, because the CIA did a lot of this stuff too. But we all know they're the same people, because what was it? Wolfowitz was, aide for Bush. He also worked in the corporate world, and he worked at the World Bank. I mean, it's an incestuous relationship between NGOs, corporations, and the government. But it represents these old, powerful interests that made money 200 years ago.
Right. Think about the revolving door of people that like leave the CIA or leave the FBI only to go work at MSNBC or CNN. There was like a high-ranking official of the FBI that was on Twitter's payroll and was heavily involved in the censorship decision for like Hunter's laptop and the Clinton stuff and whatever. And it was a law firm. He went to work for a law firm that Twitter used as a consultant, or Twitter itself. I'd have to read the story to figure it out. But basically, yeah, what you're describing is happening all over the place.
Yeah, that's the thing. So how would you sum up this whole video from Oren McIntyre? How would you do it in your words?
I mean, it seems to be an accurate description of where Moldbug is going, and so obviously I don't fault McIntyre for doing that. None of this is like an attack on McIntyre or anything like that. So if this is where we have to look for, because I've heard Dave mention the cathedral a lot of times, and I thought it was a good, like, if this is Moldbug's systematic, schema of the cathedral, I've always thought that, okay, there might be something to it. There's this network of, well, it reminds me of that what was it? Manufacturing consent, basically. I mean, people on the left have been talking about this forever. The idea of using the media, academia, whatever, to manufacture consent for all sorts of stuff. I mean, even the left's cared about this, and so there's something to it. But I thought that it was just like a mirror of what the left was talking about. However, after watching the video and seeing it systematically laid out, it seems to me the left does a better job analyzing it than Moldbug does, in the sense that the left can actually answer the question: who is useful to put at the head of the brain, right? Which contents are in the brain? Who are the academics? Who are the journalists? Who are the people that are going to be picked for this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And the left can identify who picks them by what process and what they're useful for. They already have a model to do that, and Moldbug doesn't talk about it. So I've seen here.
Yeah. Okay, now back to unqualified reservations. Miscellaneous answers to unanswered comments, July 21st, 2007. Having safely arrived in an old Dutch village on the eastern seaboard, I found that my Dutch is non-existent. They all seem to speak English these days, and the internet works perfectly. So I'm in a position to stave off the growing impression of an abandoned blog. Well, the one thing I can't resist saying here is New England is New Ireland. So again, as to the people that actually live there, and his overall arc of blaming the people that originate from New England, well, okay. Why don't you blame the Irish and Italians? They're the ones that are the dominant force in those states. Of course, you wouldn't find the Dutch there because it's mostly again Italians and the Irish. First, various persons have complained about the moniker Mencius Moldbug. I adopted this handle because of my habit of posting as Mencius on these blogs, and Moldbug on this rather different one. I agree that this is anything but eponymous, but handles are hard to change. Ask the Edge or CMDR Taco, both of whom I'm sure would love to ditch their puerile suits. I like to think mine is a little better than that. However, it certainly has nothing to do with the Chinese philosopher Carolus Mencia fungi insects, and I apologize if anyone is misled. In general, if the double-barreled monstrosity is too much of a mouthful to repeat, and there is no chance of confusion with the Chinese philosopher, I prefer the name Mencius, because no one really is named Moldbug. It only really works as a lowercase handle. I'll probably just unmask myself at some point, which he has now done, so he did follow through with that.
He did, yep.
I mean, it's not like I have an actual career anyway. I'm just very resistant to posting under my real name because if you know my real name and you search the archives of an obsolete network called Usenet for it, you'd get far too many hits. Since I'm 34, no reasonable person would associate anything written in 1992 with the individual I am now. I don't know. I mean, now we're, 15 years on, and people associate Curtis Yarvin with Unqualified Reservations. So I don't know. I think he's wrong on that point. What do you think?
Maybe.
But unfortunately, not everyone is reasonable. I recognize that this predicament has nothing to do with anything, but we all have our phobias.
Oh, I get what he's saying. I think he was a real edgelord in '92, like even more edgelord than he is now. Maybe post a few N-bombs or something.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Got it. I also want to reiterate that I'm not, in fact, reducing UR to one post a week. Rather, there's a narrative thread that runs from this blog and that has generated some long essays, and I want to make this thread slightly more formal and put it on a weekly basis. But there are also little fuzzy pieces of yarn sticking out in random directions, and these will remain. Also, there are now a few people with whose email I'm extremely delinquent. If you are one of those people, I will get back to you in the next 2 days. I swear by Odin's spear, and he didn't hang these 9 long nights for nothing, Moving back to the actual content, one commentator mentioned science fiction as a locus of resistance to universalism. Indeed, I read a huge quantity of SF growing up, and I don't mean by this to suggest that the entire genre is somehow automatically puerile. Much of it was libertarian in tone, and even when it wasn't, the exercise of imagining alternative political systems is automatically liberating. I suspect most anyone reading this had more or less the same experience. However, if you want to seriously consider alternative political systems, it is not clear to me that a fictional context, despite its distinguished historical pedigree, makes for either the best argument or the best fiction. Memorability, while not the be-all and end-all, is often an interesting test of quality. And the SF I remember best after a decade-long plus abstinence tends toward to be Heinlein or Stevenson, but more imaginative writers like Paul Park and Lucius Shepard. And if you have nothing to say, why not just say it? There's also a case to be made that the sugar pill of an imaginative context helps communicate these messages to the masses. Perhaps, but first, the idea that intellectuals have a duty to lead the non-intellectual masses is a lot of how we got into this mess to begin with. I'd much prefer to live in a world in which the masses can think whatever they want to think, ditto for the intellectuals, and no one's philosophy affects anyone else. Of course, to actually accomplish a transition to such a world or to modify present political realities in any way, the masses must at least show up and affix the imprimatur. However, this can only happen if it follows an intellectual consensus or at least a movement, and any successful intellectual movement tends to attract the masses, whether it wants to or not. So I feel it is much more useful and effective for libertarians and other dissidents to simply focus on being right. Okay, hold on. I don't even know what this even means. But first, the idea that intellectuals have a duty to lead the non-intellectual masses. Never mind, I don't want that. I'd much prefer to live in a world in which the masses can think whatever they want to think, ditto for intellectuals, and no one's philosophy affects anyone else. I mean, that's literally impossible. How would that even look, Logos?
That's impossible.
Yeah, it's impossible. I guess that sums up Moldbug in a nutshell. Huh, Logos? It's impossible.
Well, he's just too darn libertarian, man.
But then he larps about like an absolute state that just arrests everyone. So it's like, I don't get it.
Yeah, man.
You know,
Finargle and Mr. Peaceful. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, Finargle snapping those fingers is not libertarian Logos at all.
Yeah.
Also, it's not really clear how well the dissident themes in those books are absorbed. To me, it's obvious that J.K. Rowling has had one too many run-ins with moralizing Universalist bureaucrats, and one would expect her readers to be suitably primed for rebellion. Boy, was he wrong on that. Her readers turned against her.
Yeah, right?
They became the bureaucrats. On the other hand, to me, it's obvious that J.R.R. Tolkien, a far greater writer, okay, I mean, obviously that's true, despised the state and power in every form and was horrified by the universalist belief that the ring could be used. Boromir's style for good as well as evil. But if 0.1% of the people who have read Tolkien or seen those awful tone-deaf movies that were made out of his books understand this, I'd be very surprised. That's a very libertarian reading of Middle-earth, and I've seen that like on the Mises Institute stated a little more sophisticated. But I won't take a digression on why I think that's a misreading of Lord of the Rings. But the same commentators also mention congregationalism. Of course, the Congregationalists were Puritans and are now Universalists. So the link is extremely justified, and the phrase mutant congregationalism is inarguable. Still, it's interesting to know that the literal meaning of the name, the principle that each church is intellectually independent and can decide for itself any theological questions, in fact, the direct opposite to the actual orthodoxy that was imposed under the name, because the churches did not, in fact, differ and did not differ to this day. This tolerance is totally illusory. Well, I mean, this is just Moldbug again being delusional. Who are the people he's talking about? The transcendentalists. That's not, 5-point Calvinism. And furthermore, congregationalism doesn't really exist in the New England context anymore. It's not that it didn't exist. It used to. It no longer does. And part of the reason why it no longer does is it's now New Ireland. I mean, this isn't very hard. These kinds of ironies are very common in the whole Protestant context. And going back to the biological analogy, they represent a kind of misdirected immune response, an attempt to achieve mental independence, which in many, if not all cases, only resulted in newer, more effective system of indoctrination that's worth discussing in more detail. Someone else wants to know what I think of Ayn Rand. An excellent question, although it's one I have some difficulty in answering because I've never read any of Rand's books from cover to cover. I simply don't like her as a writer, which makes it hard for me to express a fair opinion of her as a thinker. Wow! That's never stopped Moldbug before, Logos.
Yep.
Oh, no, that's never stopped him before. However, with that caveat, my general view is that Rand's attempt to break out of the universalist, revelationist, liberal, conservative economy was a bold one and worthy of much respect. Objectivism is one of the few genuine root nodes in the caldogram of Western thought. You simply cannot describe it as Christian in any way, and as such, it represents a considerable achievement. For example, it differs from the Rothbardian libertarianism here. Rothbardian ethics are basically Lockean ethics, and Locke was certainly a Christian. Connecting natural rights to the Bible is not hard at all. Well, actually it is, but that's another episode entirely. But furthermore, Rand is basically famous for saying the only philosopher she was indebted to was Aristotle. So, I mean, and of course, given that Aquinas was influenced by Aristotle, is she really that outside of the norm here?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because it seems to me that Rand would be influenced by Aristotle, Nietzsche, and maybe Stirner. So
yeah, and I think Moldbug is influenced by Stirner, as I said in the beginning after reading this first blog entry.
Yep.
But there is something much too papal about Rand. She essentially constructed a system of morality and required all reasonable people to accept it. I don't find her solution to the is-ought problem any more compelling than anyone else's. To me, ethics are fundamentally a matter of taste. Well, no, Logos. Well, first of all, we heard that morality and ethics isn't real, not reals, bro. But then we can't live without it, and now it's a matter of taste.
Well, actually, it's not that it isn't real. It's that we need to find a solution that doesn't have any ethical assumptions, because people disagree on ethical assumptions, and disagreement perpetuates violence. Was the argument?
Okay.
And then he says in his nihilist blog that it's impossible to not be to not have some predisposition toward ethics. True nihilism, that's the boogeyman, is impossible. And now he's kind of agreeing again, I guess. Here, ethics is a taste that everybody kind of has. But I think he takes what is ethical and what isn't for granted. For example, this idea that we just accept the current power structures and make them accountable. What if I don't like the power structures that are here? What if I think they've been operating unethically? And so I think accountability would mean they be deposed as soon as we point them out. Well, that's an ethical consideration. And he's like, well, we just want a non-ethical thing. It is an ethical thing. Like, everything he's proposing is ultimately ethical.
Yeah.
So, like...
Well, exactly. I know. And I feel no more entitled to tell someone else they should find X ethical or Y unethical than to tell them they should like poetry and they shouldn't like badminton. I feel that all reasonable people should be reasonable. I don't ask... That's like the most new atheist thing I've heard in a long time. All reasonable people should be reasonable. It's so easy, isn't it, Logos? Just be reasonable.
Yeah, just be reasonable.
I don't ask anything more than this, and I certainly have no intention of asking universalists to stop being universalists, revelationists to stop being revelationists, Muslims to stop being Muslims, etc., etc. No, you're actually asking much, much more than this, Moldbug. You're asking that the de jure power and the de facto power become one again. That's a radical transformation of our current order, according to your view of it. Logos?
Yeah.
At least not in the sense of the values systems associated with these faiths. My view is that a great many beliefs about the real world have become associated with these value systems, and a great many people who are otherwise quite reasonable fail to evaluate their beliefs reasonably. For example, universalists like revelationists, and basically all Christians, believe that all humans are ethically equal. No rational argument can be made either for or against this question. It is what it is, and I happen to more or less like Peter Singer. I make some allowance for diminished states of consciousness share it. After all, I was raised to universals. Oh, wait. So wait, Logos, if he shares this view with the universalists, what's the beef?
Exactly.
Didn't you say like a while ago that equality was like the cause of all these problems?
Kinda, yeah.
So, like, okay, we'll just keep scratching our head. But universalists also believe that this proposition implies the position that all humans should be governed by civil servants of their own race, color, creed, or at least nationality. Never mind that this concept should be meaningless to a universalist. Obviously, I find this derivation, which is all the sense I can glean from the bizarre self-government, debatable at best and ludicrously incoherent at worst. I feel this debate is quite enough for anyone to take on. I don't think that any set of beliefs about the spirit world, theistic or atheistic, are incompatible with an accurate perception of reality. The same goes for any set of ethical beliefs. My quarrel with these various modern religions, including but not limited to the Universalists and the Revelationist versions of Christianity, is that they are all associated with beliefs about reality that are transmitted along with them, many of which are quite sound, and many of which strike me as extremely strange and remarkably unreasonable. I'm sure my judgments of many of these beliefs, metaphysical, moral, and temporal, is exactly the same as Rand's. Nevertheless, I don't feel it helps anyone to attack the metaphysical and moral elements of Christianity. That's all he does, though. He attacks Christianity for believing things that can't be proven.
Well, I think what he's saying here is that people just, if you attack Christianity's metaphysical assumptions, people just latch on to new metaphysical assumptions. So attacking something's metaphysics doesn't help because they'll just come up with a new metaphysical story. It's a whack-a-mole game you'll never win, is what he's going to try to say.
Okay, you're probably right. Let's keep going. Let's see. Yeah, especially not in the same breath in which one suggested the temporal elements of their received belief system may be complete baloney, or at least that it may be a useful exercise to treat these elements as if they were a complete baloney. if only for the purpose of reconfirming them. If this is misguided altruism, call me an altruist. In my ideal world, there are still universalist, revelationists, Buddhists, Muslims, etc. In fact, in my ideal world, I would have no problem in describing myself as... There we go again, Logos! Describe myself as... So he's a Brahmin, he's a universalist, he's a liberal. I'm still trying to figure out how this guy got big on the right.
All I mean by this is that my metaphysical and moral beliefs are basically universalist. In my ideal world, however, your metaphysical would be entirely orthogonal to your understanding of reality and how it works. Wait. If his metaphysical and moral beliefs are basically universalist, then isn't he the cause of the cathedral? I mean, he said the entire point was this was caused by hyper-Calvinism, i.e. universalism. So if he's admitting to be a universalist, then he's just admitting to be the cause of all of this. Like, what the hell's going on?
I know. In my ideal world, however, your metaphysical and moral beliefs would be entirely orthogonal to your understanding of reality and how it works, and especially to your understanding of such politically delicate fields as history and economics. Obviously, in the real world, this is not so. Another commenter mentions, among many interesting points, yes, certainly I do see the whole bizarre Puritan obsession with the Old Testament mythos as a fundamental strain on the Universalist creed. Again, this is nonsense. Like, all of the people that he wants to call universalists were constantly debunking, the Old Testament. Like, who's he talking about? A fundamental strand. What? Like, all of these new atheist types, liberal progressive types, they were debunking the Old Testament all the time. That's where we got the American Taliban.
Right.
David Gelernter's new book, Americanism. I have a copy of this book and I intend to review it here. So please stay tuned. Also, anyone can call me anything they like so long as they don't mention my true name, which I received 1,000 centuries ago on the fire planet Zond. I would be forced to return to my original form and destroy them, and nobody wants that. I feel a backquote is desirable here for no particular reason. However, I think serious discussions begin on both sides when CFR personnel began appearing on television news programs with the person's name and simple title, Council on Foreign Relations, beneath. All right, well, hold on. He's going to talk about the CFR. So let's take a little quick detour and see where the CFR came from. This might help us out with his fivefold division later. It was, let's see here, 1921. David Rockefeller. Whoa, what do you know, Logos? What do you know? It's almost like big money's behind all this.
Yep.
Oh, what do you know? I mean, give me a break. This is so stupid. Personally, I keep tabs on the world conspiracy by reading Foreign Affairs every month. A $32 a year, 2 years for $60, you may peer directly into the core of a progressive universalist nervous system and monitor the most intimate and therefore banal goings on there. Wells was right. The conspiracy is totally open. Well, who is he? Wait, was this him? A back quote, block quote. So he's not really telling you where it's from, right?
Scroll down. Maybe he will after the fact.
No. Okay, well, we'll keep reading because this is actually important. Wells was right. The conspiracy is totally open. I mean, really, what are you going to do about it? FA is evil at its wonkiest. How best to achieve a federal world state without sexism and racism managed by a transnational NGO of zero accountability? The rest of it is even more trivial. Now that we have the levers of power, what settings are best? The siesta-inducing cover story this month is concerned that globalization's benefits are insufficiently distributed, which any honest economists, not that they're any living, could have told you would be the cause. The apparatchik solution, a new deal for globalism, well, that can't go wrong. Once the UN is granted power to tax, all of the success that the U.S. is currently enjoying, from the income tax, the Right Society, the war on poverty, the civil rights movement, etc., at all, can be expanded to encircle the globe. The rough beast came round to Bethlehem at last. Indeed, as for honest economics, I hope to offer a little in that vein myself, but one could do a lot worse than the Mises Institute. Oh boy, watch out, Logos. No, but the point is that whoever this guy is right on the money because, Wells, One World Government, NGOs. So, I mean, I read Wells's 2 books, the New World Order and the Moldbug Conspiracy. And this was basically, the enlightened technocrats. So if Moldbug is conversant with this and favorably quotes this, why is it that we've not seen this until now, 20 plus hours in, and he doesn't seem to bring it up in the future? Because I've never heard anybody bring up H.G. Wells in relation to Moldbug.
Well, I think this is going to be his bureaucracy part of the structure of power.
Okay, but then that's just technicians.
Yeah.
Which means Alul's right. Right? So,
Well, but Alul thinks technicians have all the power, and Moldbug doesn't think that these people have all the power.
Well, right. But then if he's talking about this globalist system, it's put together by these technicians. He's mentioning Wells, and Wells was their spokesman, as was, Russell and Huxley. And so, yeah. But yeah, I know the arguments he's going to make. We've already been through that.
Yep.
Another commenter more or less answers her own question, but observes. Well, before I move on, this other thing too. Now that we're like in radical austerity, right, where now it's like the build back better. But even then, like 2007 and 2008 with the financial crash, there was the whole austerity revolts all throughout Europe. The idea that these people were just going to have this global New Deal, like that just did not pan out at all. It's like, and it's strange that Moldbug and people like him would think that that's what they were doing.
Yeah.
There's a much better example for what's going on. And there was a book called Confessions of an Economic Hitman by Perkins. And he talks about how he was working for the deep state. He would basically, offer these countries deals they couldn't afford to ignore, which would then collapse their economy and have their assets carted off. Right around the time, I think between 2007 and 2011, when you still had anti-globalists left, they were saying there was a documentary that had come out about Argentina being collapsed, which ended in 99, 2000, and they said that was going to happen to the United States. And that's what's happening now. And of course, that whole left disappeared after 2011. And so I didn't hear anything more about it. But about a year or two ago, I remembered some of those earlier documentaries that I watched where they talked about this. And I'm like, wait, we're living through that right now. And this is just, after having, collapsed and consumed the capital from around the world, they're now turning in to do it in the United States. And that actually explains something. Nothing here in Moldbug does. Not yet.
Right.
Another commenter more or less answers his or her own question, but observes that the views of the UN has changed over time. Indeed, they have. Reality has shown many universalists that the UN is not the organization they want it to be. But this does not change their emotional attachment to the idea of the UN, the idea of world government that it represents. It simply reminds them that there's a very long road from here to there. Moreover, I think that a number of diehard right-wing UN haters in the U.S., as represented by the set of people who believe the U.S. should leave the UN, an easily pollable question, has in general declined over time, but I have no numbers on this. It's just a guess. Lastly, the question everyone's been waiting for: why don't the Universalists do something useful like legalize pot? Well, Logos, they did. Fascinating question, because one of the notes at all hippie ideas of the 60s that involved making the state bigger and stronger pretty much happened, whereas all the others pretty much not. This certainly deserves its own discussion, but I will just say one thing: the answer is in Juvenile. But Logos, they did legalize pot. This didn't end very well, did it?
Sorry, who legalized pot?
Well, there's all sorts of states now that are legalizing pot. The movement is
Oh,
winning.
yeah.
So what I'm saying is, why hasn't it happened yet? That's such an asinine question. I mean, well, what time scale are we looking at here?
Yeah.
It's happening now. So there you go. And by the way, the people that oppose legalizing pot were largely conservatives. So he's blaming the wrong people for that one anyhow.
Yeah.
Democracy is an adaptive fiction, July 25th, 2000.
Well, wait, he wanted pot legalized. useful like legalizing, but he's a libertarian. He wants
Yeah, no,
public life.
he does. I know, but he's attacking the progressives for not legalizing it. But they're the ones that aren't slowing up the process of legalization. It's the conservatives.
Well, yeah, what he's asking is, with all this nefarious crap the universalists are doing with globalization, open borders, whatever else, why can't they at least throw him a bone and at least give him pot to go with it? That's basically what he's asking them.
Yeah, well, that was on the agenda. I mean, that's Brave New World. It just takes time.
Just takes time. Yeah, we got it.
We got it. I mean, it just takes time. It's Brave New World. I mean, it's to quote Johnny Cash, referring to a different book, it's going by the book. Okay. It's been a while since I posted anything really controversial and offensive here, and I have a vague sense that there are some new readers who don't know what they've gotten into. Sure, it's still legal to read you are, but unless you take special precautions, you're leaving a trail of HTTP requests that future regimes may have no trouble at all in tracing to you personally. These may well qualify you for a stint in one of those new impatient sensitivity facilities mellow out, as Jello Biafra put it, or you will pay. Try tapping on the wall. I might hear you. In any case, today, I thought it'd be fun to talk about democracy. Unless you are 107 years old and a veteran of the Austrian Landwehr, you probably associate democracy with peace, freedom, progress, and prosperity. Since I associate democracy with war, tyranny, destruction, and poverty, we'll certainly have something to talk about. My guess is that the conventional view of democracy, which I, of course, grew up with, is what we call an adaptive fiction. And adaptive fiction is a misperception of reality that, unlike most such misperceptions, manages to outcompete the truth. For example, suppose we somehow become convinced that warm beer is refreshing, whereas cold beer is poisonous. Obviously a fiction and obviously maladaptive in our society. However, if we imagine a hot country run by brewers who control their serfs by paying them only in lager, which means being warm themselves, which being warm leaves them both tipsy and unrefreshed, hence quite incapable of revolt, you get the idea. In this Brewers' Republic, the warm beer fiction is what Gianto Mosca calls a political formula. Mosca's philosophy is nicely summarized in James Burnham's The Machiavellian Defenders of Freedom, which at $50 for a used pocketbook is positively a bargain and about as close as you'll get to the oligarchy collectivism. A political formula is a belief that makes the ruler accept their that makes the rules accept the ruler. Since the former tend to outnumber the latter, a political formula, if not absolutely essential, an excellent way to cut down on your security costs. A political formula is adaptive because the rulers have obviously both motive and opportunity to promote it. The best example of a political formula is a divine right monarchy, simply because this formula is defunct. Hardly anyone these days believes in the divine right of kings, since at one time most everyone did. We have incontrovertible proof that adaptive fictions can exist in human societies. Either divine right monarchy is a fiction and people then were systematically deluded, or kings do rule by the grace of God and people now are systematically deluded. Of course, both, because Mosca's second example of a political formula is a democracy. In UR terms, democracy is a core tenet of universalism. It's really not possible to be a universalist and not believe in democracy. It's like being a Catholic and thinking the Virgin Mary was just some chick. Well, that's just clearly not true, right? I mean, the Soviet Union was a totalitarian regime, and I'm pretty sure he considers them universalist. So,
Wait, he considers who universalists?
the Soviet Union.
Does he consider them universalists?
I mean, they held the beliefs that he defined as universalism.
Yeah, he's gonna have to.
And they're totalitarian. So there you go. Oh, well. Oh, well. Universalism is the faith of the Brahmins, the intellectual caste whose global dominance has been unchallenged, arguably since World War II, and certainly since the end of the Cold War. Since an intellectual is defined by his or her ability to influence the opinions of others, it's not hard to see why a democracy is such an effective political formula. See, I don't like that definition of an intellectual. The old class definition was somebody whose intellectual work was what do you earn money from. That's the use of intellectual that I can run with. This one is a little too vague. As Walter Lippmann pointed out 75 years ago, public opinion in democracy is a sort of funhouse mirror that reflects, albeit inaccurately, imperfectly, and quite reluctantly, the views of the governing elite. To be fair, It also has a certain flittering effect which discourages some of the nuttiest intellectual fads, if only because they can be positively incomprehensible to anyone who hasn't been to Harvard. But the history of extraordinary popular delusions does not afford much confidence. And with only a few exceptions, the beliefs held at elite schools in the Unionist, Lincoln to Wilson, Progressive, Wilson to FDR, and Universalist, FDR to now periods, have been leading indicators of American public opinion. Very generally, the consensus at Harvard at the year Y is the consensus of America at Y plus 50. If that isn't power, what is? So I know what I have a suspicion what he's going to do with this, and he did this before, so I want to make this clear. He's going to equate a lot of the leftist intellectuals with Walter Lippmann's. They're so duped that they think that America's a democracy, or that what they want is Walter Lippmann's managed democracy. Democracy is not real, bro. But you see, that's not true. Like Chomsky routinely pointed out in, of all things, Manufacturing Consent, that Lippmann did create this managed democracy. In fact, many of the far left types that he doesn't like, including Iglesias, would have said America is not a democracy, and that's the problem. And so I don't know who he's actually targeting here. Just the
Good question.
Because a lot of these leftist intellectuals he doesn't like, they already know who Walter Lippmann is. They already know about managed democracy, and they already know that it's not real democracy. And of course, it's a fun house of mirrors. But okay, so who is the magician, running all these mirrors? Well, it's the corporations, right? That's why they have Lippmann's managed democracy, in order to get people to not see who's the man behind the curtain. I don't think anyone reasonable would dispute this. What I do think many reasonable people would dispute is the claim that democracy is a fiction, which, note, I have not justified at all. In fact, it's perfectly possible for a political formula to be an accurate description of reality. If democracy is the rule of the Brahmins, fine, but don't the Brahmins seem to be doing a pretty good job of it? Didn't we have, with a few small exceptions, peace, freedom, prosperity, and progress? And even more damning, don't the places in the world that lack democracy also seem to lack these things? It's all very convincing, but you see, a political formula has to be convincing. We're not talking about something some a-hole came up with on his lunch break. We're looking at the result of 200 plus years of adaptive evolution. Again, this is not an accident. This is not adaptation. This is a deliberate, intentional conspiracy. See, why is Moldbug constantly pretending there isn't an actual conspiracy going on? He even mentioned Wells in the open conspiracy. He literally mentioned Wells' last article. Logos.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a conspiracy.
Well, yeah, but it's also an open conspiracy. Well,
okay, yes, but it can't be adaptive. It can't be a natural process.
Why not?
Well, no. So, if humans are making choices to do something, that's not a natural process. Natural process is like the surf eroding a cliff.
I think his definition of a natural process is any game theoretic end state. So think of the prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah.
Right. Let's suppose somebody screws you over, and so you can't trust them to cooperate, and so you always take the competitive solution. Well, because they screwed you over, it was only natural that you're going to not rely on them to form a cooperative strategy, and so you default to one of those Nash equilibria. And so he thinks of natural in a game theoretic sense.
Right. But the way it's commonly used, again, he's using a lot of new atheist jargon. Mm-hmm. And that's normally meant to imply that there's no will or choice behind it.
I mean, they would argue there is no will or choice behind it. It's just a corollary of game theory that everybody's bound to.
Right. But the thing is, the decisions being made are choices by an elite cabal.
Well, they are, but the way they're being packaged is what's the adaptive evolution part. So they didn't like when the Catholic Church did it, so let's shut off the stuff that didn't fly with the Catholic Church, and let's put on a new dress, basically. And that's the idea, is each time the environment becomes more and more and more hostile to these ideas, we have to keep rebranding them. That's the part that keeps evolving.
Right, but then again, okay, well then I'm going to question that it's a natural process yet again, because the environmental conditions are the result of increasing levels of material complexity, which are not natural, but the result of the advent of the march of technology.
Yeah, he's taking the level of technological progress as given. Like we talked about this last time, I think,
Yeah.
where he has on his worldview that technological process is a given that just can't be stopped unless your society is going to die. And so, given that, what are the natural outcomes?
Right, but again, this is only something we've seen for the last 200 years, which is completely unrelated to any other prior historical period.
Of course, yeah.
So then it can't be this is so what I'm saying is he want like a sort of a conservative thinking. He wants to assume that this is a part of a broader universal pattern of behavior, and it's not.
Hmm.
It's radically different from everything we've seen before.
Yeah.
And that's what he can't seem to admit.
No,
which,
he can't.
Which it is. I mean, it obviously is.
Hmm.
We should expect. We should wait. Okay, we shouldn't expect a sordid little lie. We should expect a spectacular masterpiece of incredible mendacity. It is, in fact, an adaptive fiction, and it certainly seems prudent to start by assuming the worst. Democracy has fooled pretty much all the people, pretty much all the time, at least for most of the 20th century. So I could point out that the Austro-Hungarian Empire had plenty of peace, freedom, prosperity, and progress, and hardly any democracy, or that the same can be said of Dubai, Hong Kong, and even, in many ways, Singapore, or that the founders who created the American Republic, for the most part, feared and despised mob rule, or that the Civil War was more than justified these fears, or that so-called democracies of the progressive and universalist eras, especially colonial confections such as the EU, combine a homeopathic dose of democracy with an allopathic dose of Hegelian civil service state, whose functionaries are intentionally unaccountable to the people, and whose jobs would change not at all if effective offices suddenly became familial, as in the fact that they may be in the early stages of doing. But this would be the same kind of argument that is made in favor of a democracy, a jumble of negative associations to counter the jumble of positive associations, hardly effective against the sacred status quo. As Swift said, it's useless to try to reason a man out of something he was never reasoned into. And certainly few of us were reasoned into democracy. However, I do vaguely remember my earliest and surely entirely received thoughts on why democracy is so great, and perhaps it's worthwhile trying to unravel the string from the beginning. As I recall, I thought democracy was great because America was obviously democratic and free. It was opposed to the Soviet system, which was non-democratic and non-free, and both had fought a war against the mid-20th century Germans, who were non-democratic and evil. It was pretty clear to me, as it still is, that the parties running these non-democratic states were simply mafias. So we have the association, again, democracy equals free and prosperous, non-democracy equals tyrannous and poor. Case closed, it would seem. Unfortunately, correlation does not imply causation, and there's another causal explanation of this correlation that makes at least as much sense. The standard view of democracy is like the cure of the disease. The disease might simply be described as primitiveness. The primitive way of government is tyrannous and frankly bestial, going back to the chimpanzees with their chief chimps and chimp wars. But wait a minute, Lois, isn't all government just chimp wars?
Yeah, all government is just chimp wars. Well, by analogy, anyway. Yeah.
So that's okay. Democracy cures this disease and allows us to have HDTVs and iPhones. Those who don't take the democracy pill are stuck in chimp world and have to live under chimp government, fishing for ants with sticks.
Yeah, I think he's trying to parody how pro-democracy people think of anti-democracy people.
Yeah, he's right in that regard. That's how they did talk. I mean, I remember those people. They did talk that way. In the invert view, democracy is like a poison. The permanent contest for political power that democracy creates is an extreme case of limited war, in which no weapons at all are allowed and battle is resolved by counting heads. In other words, democracy is a permanent source of friction. Only a very stable, healthy, and homogeneous society can withstand this poison. And those that can't, the cultural convention of limited warfare breaks down, and true civil war emerges, culminating in, of course, chimp government. So a free, prosperous, democratic society is like a person who is so strong and healthy, he can take a dose of arsenic every day, or at least every 4 years, and still survive, sort of. The free, prosperous, democratic society might be remarkably unfree and unprosperous compared to an undemocratic society that never took the arsenic, but so few of the latter survived the last 2 centuries that we have no basis for comparison. You can't really compare the U.S. or France to Singapore or Dubai. Even the Central Powers of World War I were anything but free from democratic politics. And in an exercise in imagining what 180 years of technical progress would have brought to, say, France of Charles X, is it entirely the department of fantasy? But you see, this is just begging the question, right? Because at one point, divine right of kings, monarchs ruled Europe, and then they didn't. And so the argument then would be, who had more power in 1700? The divine right of kings, monarchs, or revolutionary democratic ideals? Well, obviously the divine right of king monarchs. So yet, having all the power, they still couldn't adapt and innovate fast enough to beat their liberal democratic rivals. I mean, we already know how this turns out. You don't need to speculate about Charles X. All you need to know is that they lost. Right?
The history stuff goes over my head a bit, but sounds like it.
I mean, let me just put it this way. Given that we already have a test case of all these groups getting BTFO'd by liberal democracy, what would make you think that they could innovate and stand up to it a second time if they couldn't do it the first?
Right.
That's the simple question, which I've never seen an answer to. Meanwhile, the undemocratic, tyrannous societies are not those which fail to take democratic arsenic, but those which took it and found it fatal. Of course, they are no longer ingesting the medication. Their lips do not move, and their throat does not swallow. Civil society has been destroyed. I'm sure there are one or other 2 20th century tyrannies which did not get that way as a result of a democratic degringolade, but I find it hard to think of them. Both the standard and inverted perspectives are quite consistent with historical fact, and the inverted model is by no means as unusual as one may think. Every time you hear someone decrying the presence of politics in government, he or she is expressing it. Anyone who praises nonpartisan or bipartisan, or so help me, post-partisan government, or especially the European desire, decries the existence of populist parties or politicians, or even who believes there is no room for extremism in politics, is stating their fear and distrust of democracy. Yet none of them will put it in these terms. In conventional universalist discourse, therefore, the democratic state becomes a kind of sickbed patient, an employment opportunity for every chiropractor, homeopath, or bloodletter under the sun. Its health is constantly fretted over in the direst terms. All the problems of democracy can be solved by more democracy. So the first thing I want to address here is, even if so we're gonna use managed democracy. He's already mentioned Lippmann. Okay, that's all well and good. The problems he's talking about in society are not the result of Lippmann's fiction. They're the result of the people who are running the country, the corporate class, who use Lippmann's fiction. This isn't hard. I mean, why did Lippmann come up with this? Because he wanted to defend the technocrats.
Exactly. Yep.
So you can't blame the illusion for the cause. I mean, because illusions don't have power, right? Didn't he say that ideas and metaphysical realities can't impact or do anything?
The ideas don't. People's reactions to them do.
Right, but the thing is, though, but then who is causing the idea? Well, the people who want to hide their power.
Right.
Yeah. Most people don't know this, but Marxist-Leninist thinkers saw socialism in the same way. Socialism had this problem. It had that problem. Yes, it was true that turnips were rotting in the fields and men were sent to Siberia for speaking their minds. But was this an occasion to discard all the achievements of socialism? Wouldn't that be curing acne with decapitation? Shouldn't we instead move forward to a kinder and more efficient socialism? The temptation to reform rather than abandon the adaptive fiction is omnipresent. Well, I got an adaptive fiction, Logos. The idea that, unaccountable transnational global corporations are the result of all of the benefits that we have in the United States. And sure, we have depressed wages because of scabs. And, sure, a lot of on-the-job fatalities. And yeah, sure, wages are going down. But hey, I mean, you don't want to give up your HGTV, bro. I mean, we got to have Rockefeller, right?
You know it.
Another way the democratic fiction protects itself is to define democracy as a successful democracy. Therefore, it is easy to see that democracy is always successful. For example, there was a democratic election in Iraq using one of the most democratic of democratic forms, proportional representation, specifically recommended by the UN. And there's now a democratic government. This government is incapable of enforcing the law or even administering itself. However, so it cannot be true democracy. And no one thinks that the failure of democracy in Iraq casts any aspersion on democracy. Even the pessimists concluded that Iraq is simply not ready for democracy. The ultra-pessimists conclude that Iraq may never be ready, presumably because of its strong tribal culture and its national IQ of 87. No one seems to suspect democracy itself. If your medicine routinely kills the weak and spares only the sturdy, Occam's razor doesn't lead you to suspect that it's bad for sick people, but good for healthy ones. Well, wow, Logos. So if the medicine of like the crappy corporate 9-to-5 job kills everybody but the sturdy, I guess Occam's razor doesn't tell you to get rid of corporations, does it?
Guess not.
Guess not. What do you know? In fact, the word democracy has narrowed over time to focus on these democratic forms, which have been more correlated with success.
Yeah, this actually gets me thinking about what were we talking about right before the stream?
Yeah. I know. Reversing this definition creep is difficult and an unenviable task, so I'll resort to my usual tricks and define a new word which corresponds to the literal derivation of democracy rather than its present connotations. Okay, all Moldbug does is definition creep. So who's he to complain?
Yeah, that's true.
All right. I actually have to go take care of something real quick. Logos, you said you'd stick around and interact with the chat. I'll be back shortly.
Sounds good to me. How's it going, chat? Something, no one, how's it going? Wow, you guys have been busy today. Trying to catch up here. It's hard to keep track of the chat when I'm focused on sharing videos and stuff, so I'm trying to see what y'all have been up to. A lot of cool stuff about secret societies in here I didn't know about. Yeah, I saw somebody in the chat earlier asking about the like a paperback version of Moldbug's book, and so I posted an Amazon link in the chat in case people wanted to read this like physical copy to take their own notes on it or whatever. I'm not very good at talking to chat.
It's okay because I'm back.
There we go.
I'm back. Okay. Let's define demotism as rule in the name of the people. Any system of government in which the regime defines itself as representing or embodying the popular or general will can be described as demotist. Demotism includes all systems of government which trace their heritage to the French or American revolutions. If anything, it errs on the broad side. The Eastern Bloc, which regularly described itself as a people's democracy, was certainly demotist. So was the NS. It is hard to see how Volk and demos are anything but synonyms. But communism and Nazism were in fact obsessed with managing public opinion. Well, I mean, the obvious difference between folk and demos is the demos can be multiple ethnicities. The folk can't. Now, maybe for Moldbug, it's a distinction without a difference, but that's still, I think, a relevant distinction to be had. What do you think, Logos?
It's that very last part you said. What was the distinction without a difference?
Well, okay, so folk is, demos can be multiple ethnicities. Folk
Sure. Okay, yeah, that's true.
And that is a relevant difference.
It's a very relevant difference.
Well, he even said that democracies only work in ethnically homogeneous societies. Almost like maybe democracy isn't the real problem here, Logos.
Well, that's a good point. Clever Moldbug trying to hide stuff again.
Yeah, trying to hide stuff again. Like all governments, their rule is certainly backed by force, if more so in the case of... You know what? How about this, Logos? Like all corporations, their rule was backed up by force. What is he talking about? Oh, only the government uses force, Logos.
It's almost like everybody who wants to rule something uses force. I mean, he knows that. I mean, Mr. Ring of Finargle. I mean, what's he playing at here?
I know, right? Oh, but not me. I'm just running a Fortune 500 company. I'm just following the NAP logos. What did I do wrong?
Exactly.
If more so in the case of communism, the pre-war Gestapo had less than 10,000 employees, but political formulae were of great importance to them. It's hard to argue that the NS and Bolshevik states were any less deified than any clerical divine right monarchy. Most people in democratic states tend to instinctively classify political systems into two types, democracies and everything else. Of course, this dichotomy is typical of all political formulas. Any regime constituted under a conflicting formula must be somehow invalid. The old monarchist aristocratic order in Europe, which was certainly not perfect, falls into everything else. And thus we wind up putting, say, Elizabeth I and Stalin into the same bag. The difference between... Well, okay, so if that's absurd, then putting Stalin and FDR in the same bag is also absurd. Right?
Exactly, yeah.
No, they can't do it, Logos. That's absurd. But when I do it, I'm just being reasonable. I mean, I'm just a reasonable person being reasonable, and all reasonable people accept the bag that I use. The difference between a monarch and a dictator is that the monarchical succession is defined by law, and the dictatorial succession is defined by power. WTF, man. Like any cursory reading of the history of England will tell you that monarchical succession is defined by force. Like, how do you think William the Conqueror, got to become King of England?
I have no idea, man. This is... Yeah, we talked about this last time. Not last time, time before this. Remember we were talking about, like, the academy and how, like, the academy used to be different when the government wasn't socialized. We talked about how the kings wanted to use force to rule and start wars, and so they always had to call the nobility, and the nobility ended up getting a bunch of stuff from. So the nobility were basically the government, like, implicitly, and they were the ones that, like, did patronage and funded all these academics and artists and stuff like that, even back in the day.
If you do all the stuff our government does, don't worry, Logos, you're totally not the government.
Totally not the government.
No, well, I mean, it's in the name, William the Conqueror. He conquered England. Then there was the succession in the early 12th century between Stephen and Matilda, the anarchy, and then you had the War of the Roses, which completely destroyed England from 1455 to 1485. And so, of course, it's by... I don't know where this delusional fairy tale gets developed that the power of the monarch, is not raw power. I mean, the king sends his knights up to your house, and he's like, I'm going to confiscate your property. What do you do? Nothing. I mean, it's over. And
yeah.
And then, of course, nobody's in with England prior to 1688. The line of succession was always in serious jeopardy of being contested by force. So I don't know where this like fantasy, childish reading comes from. It's so bizarre. I'm still trying to figure out where this comes from. I know this kind of thinking can be found in Hop. I know this kind of thinking can be found in Kunin Ladin, but like it didn't originate with them, and I'm still trying to figure out who it originated with. The effect in the latter is that the fish rots from the head down. Lawlessness permeates the state as in a mafia family, because contending leaders must form informal coalitions. Since another name for monarchist is a legitimist, we can contrast the legitimist and demotic theories of government. Perhaps unsurprisingly, I see legitimism as a sort of proto-formalism. The royal family is a perpetual corporation, the kingdom is the property of the corporation, and the whole thing is a sort of real estate venture on a grand scale. Why does the family own the corporation of the kingdom? Because it does. Oh, no, logos. You're right. So, Todd, remember, why does William the Conqueror own England? Well, just because he does, logos. He just does.
Yeah, Magic and Pixie Dust gave the Conqueror England. Got it.
Got it. Property is historically arbitrary. Well, what arbitrates this? Well, he's a Sternerite. He knows. He knows force arbitrates this. He's just not telling you that. The best way for the monarchies of old Europe to modernize, in my book, would have been to transition the corporation from family ownership to shareholder ownership, eliminating the hereditary principle which caused so many problems for so many monarchies. However, the trouble with corporate monarchism is that it presents no obvious political formula because it does cut no ice with a mob of pitchfork-wielding peasants. I mean, it's kind of what happened to England after 1688. We don't really have any of these, monarchical power struggles anymore because it kind of is a corporation. But I don't think he'd like, the current monarchy of England. So the legitimate system went down another path, which led eventually to its destruction, the path of divine right monarchy, when everyone believes in God because God says so, is a much more impressive formula. Perhaps the best way to look at demotism is to see it as the Protestant version of rule by divine right, because on the theory of vox populi vox dei, if you add divine right monarchy to a religious system that is shifting from the worship of God to the worship of man, demotism is pretty much what you'd expect to precipitate in the beaker. Why not the worship of nature, like radical environmentalists, or why not the worship of the state, like in North Korea? That's apparently the only natural outcome, logos.
I guess.
The modest political forms have varied a good bit, but the phrase that expresses demotism as well as I can think of is self-government. I frequently see the term used as if it means something. In fact, it does not, which is perhaps the best debunking of democracy I can offer. Does self-government mean government by yourself? Certainly. Self-employment means employment by yourself. Self-abuse means abuse by yourself, etc. But the idea of government by yourself is inherently tautological. Unless you're possessed by a demon, you govern yourself by definition.
Oh,
that's so BS. What is he? That's so BS.
It's all your libertarian debates come back to haunt you, Todd, all at once.
Yeah. Well, you're right. That's a whole separate issue we can explore, but no, he's just being pedantic and stupid, right? If we look at philosophy, he pretends to have some familiarity with the concept. Man, going back to, ancient Greece 101, Plato and Aristotle, man has appetites and desires. They get in the way of him doing the right thing, gets him into trouble. Most men have a hard time controlling those things. Controlling those things is the definition of self-government. Self-government is a philosophical concept, a philosophical ethical concept that evolved into a political concept. He knows this. He's being intentionally dishonest. And then to your point, yeah, Mr. Libertarian, are you possessed by a demon? What do you want to say, Logos?
Well, it's also, he's just talking about the principle of self-ownership, basically. And you've already raked libertarians over the coals about that, quite often.
Right, but see, here's the difference, right? Self-government is not the same as self-ownership. Now, maybe that's the way he's using it.
That's the way he's using it.
Yeah.
That's why it's tautological. We all have this principle of self-ownership, and so self-ownership or self-government so he's defining a government as that which owns you. So since you always own yourself, self-government is just tautological.
Right. Yeah, that's a lot to break down that I disagree with completely. I'll just have to leave that for another day because we have to keep going to finish this. If the term means anything in this sense, it means that there's no other form of government, no government at all, anarchy. But clearly, this is not what people talk of when they talk of self-government mean. If we are governed at all, we are governed by others, and thus self-government is a classical Orwellian paradox. Only if you use Moldbuggy and wait for it, definition creep. In which case, yes. But if you don't do definition creep, then no. In practice, the term seems most commonly to refer to government by persons of the same race, culture, language, or social class as oneself. Since I am not in fact a bigot, it's quite unclear why this should matter to me. Surely I can be either oppressed or treated decently by people of any race, color, or creed, whether my own or someone else's. Well, okay. There's a lot you can say about this. The first thing that you can say about this, without making any sort of value judgments as to anyone in particular, one of the things that we've talked about, Logos, is when people have different, say, cultures, come from different classes, have different lexicons for what words mean, it becomes nearly impossible to communicate effectively with people. And so if you have all of those things in common that Moldbug just mentioned, well, what do you know, Logos? There's a lot less you have to argue about. You can kind of get right to the meat of the issue.
Right.
Almost like it's intrinsically valuable. What do you know?
I guess.
What do you know? No, but Logos, we're just super special, magical, individualist snowflakes that are just, actualizing our own self-interest, in this ex ante sense of a mutual exchange with the NAP. Duh. From the perspective of its subjects, what counts is not who runs the government, but what the government does. Good government is effective, lawful government. Bad government is ineffective, lawless government. How would anyone reasonable could disagree with these statements is quite beyond me, and yet clearly almost everyone does. If we look at the entire demotist family consisting of Anglo-American liberal democracy, Marxist-Leninism, and NS, the last two are clearly disasters. There's a strange tendency in contemporary universalist thought to see the NS as something on an entirely different plane of evil than Marxist-Leninism. For example, purging NS is routine, whereas purging neo-communists is McCarthyism. I don't understand this at all, but then again, I don't understand a lot of universalist doctrine. All right, well, I do understand this, and I can explain in very short detail why this is the case. So I was thinking about the problem with technology as a whole, and, as Ilu points out, we become cogs in the machine, as Ivan Illich points out. And since humans really aren't cogs in a machine, the ultimate solution is to get rid of the humans because, well, they're just extraneous to the workings of the machine. And while all three of those groups, the mid-20th century Germans, the communists, and the liberal democracies, were all jockeying for influence in the 30s as to who was most compatible with the machine, NS was the first to lose. And they were the first to lose because they were ethnic parochialists, right? The machine doesn't right. What does the machine want? Social plasticity. It wants to dilute and dissolve and shred all actual organic identities. So of course, NS is a bad fit for the machine because it wants to preserve at least one identity, which the whole technical process is trying to shred. The communists weren't. They were shredding these identities, and so were the liberal democracies. So they could agree in this striving for social plasticity, and NS is like, oh no, we can't do that because we don't want to preserve any of these organic identities. And that, I think, is what explains ultimately why you get this double standard of treatment. What do you think about that, Logos?
I think that could be, yeah.
I mean, it's the most plausible with what we got. This leaves us with liberal democracy. As we've seen time and again, here you are. The word liberal is meretricious to perfection, so we need a substitute. Perhaps lawful will do. Let's define lawful democracy as a demotist government that upholds the rule of law. In other words, universalist lawful democracy is the least demotist of demotisms. Demotism light. if you will. Compared to communism and NS, there's much to be said for it, but this is a rather low bar. I think it's pretty clear that if you lived in 1750 and a djinn appeared to explain the history of demotism in the next 250 years and gave you the option of erasing all of it and sticking with legitimism, you'd have to be a fairly perverse and sadistic fellow to decline the offer. It's difficult to even scrape together 10 to the 6 victims of legitimate governments, let alone 10 to the 8 plus the communists and NS racked up, not forgetting the millions or so killed in ruthless universalist city bombing of World War II, which were certainly war crimes by the standard of anyone who can produce a river of tears for the sufferers of Guantanamo. Okay, so this whole paragraph is so intentionally dishonest, it's insane. So notice, if we look at lethality in war and government killing, and we've had government repression and war since forever, what is the cause of the increasing lethality? Mechanization. Everybody knows this. The problem isn't, do you have, representative democratic government over here or a top-down authoritarian government over here? We've had those throughout all of history. We don't have body counts like World War I or World War II or Stalin's purges. All of this is the result of technological advancement and mechanization.
I mean, right.
What?
I said, right. I mean, go back to Athens, for example, and compare any war Athens got into with itself or with any other country and compare its body count to something like, the height of the Middle Ages or something. And you're probably going to see, dwarf body counts just because there wasn't enough people or technology back then when Athens was fighting. Well, there we go, guys. We've solved it. By Moldbug's own standard, Athenian democracy is clearly superior.
Right, but see, that's the point. This was a libertarian trope that the death tolls were higher, quote unquote, because of democracy, not due to technological advancement. Which that's the actual smoking gun here.
Right.
But again, that's the thing that Moldbug's trying to hide. That technicians run everything, and so we can't talk about them. Because it is interesting, right, that on the one hand, quote-unquote, democratic USA and quote-unquote undemocratic NS can both kill an awful lot of people really fast in the 20th century. It's like, I wonder what the commonality to all this is, Logos.
Exactly.
The reason it's so difficult to oppose lawful democracy is that we have so few alternatives to compare it to. Existential dissidents in the Soviet Union, for example, the desire to defeat the system, not just reform it, derived an enormous percentage of its credibility from the fact that the West clearly existed. And clearly much propaganda notwithstanding worked better. The West has no West of its own. Besides tiny fossils of old Europe like Andorra, Monaco, and Liechtenstein, the only successful non-democratic states in the world are Singapore, Hong Kong, and Dubai, each of which is interesting and impressive, but none of which are without problems. I don't normally spend much time in the Universalist blogosphere, because I consider myself pretty familiar with the product, but these threads on Singapore struck me as interesting and sincere. Okay, no, this is a really interesting and very dishonest framing device here, right? He says that the actual competition that just ended, the Cold War, he says that the West clearly existed and clearly, much propaganda notwithstanding, worked much better. So he's not going, imagine like a left-wing Moldbug. Well, we just don't have any comparison to socialism in the present day. We just have these fossil states like Cuba and North Korea. I mean, if only we had a real socialism to challenge the West of the West, then we'd win. I mean, how is that not what he's doing for monarchies? Monarchies already had their time and failed.
Yeah, basically.
I mean, it's just all special pleading nonsense. And he's getting it from Hop and Kuhn and Ledeen.
Yep.
And the other thing is, while we're on this tangent, you know who was behind the EU? The Habsburgs. Otto von Habsburg was one of the guys who got the Charlemagne Prize for the European Union. He also supported Kalergi, who's a villain on the alt-right for trying to modify Europe. So, your own guys are like globalists that are working hand in glove with the people that you're talking. I mean, the whole thing just breaks down.
Who are the Habsburgs? I'm an idiot and don't know a bunch of history.
The Habsburgs are the people that governed Austria from 1250 until World War I.
Got it. Oh, makes sense. Okay.
And he mentioned Austria-Hungary. That was the people that ran Austria-Hungary.
Wow. Well, that's kind of strange, right? Because basically, then we do have this test case for monarchy. We have these wannabe monarchs, and we see what they're doing right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. I mean, let's look at Spain, right? Franco, the darling of the alt-right, what happens when he dies and King Carlos comes to the throne? Well, he opens the floodgates to the pause, and Spain goes from one of the most reactionary states in Europe to one of the most liberal.
Right.
Womp womp. Monarchy for the win, right, Logos?
I guess.
So there is no getting around it. Democracy may be, as I contend, a lie, but the lie has us by the gills. It's not going away anytime soon. The reason I oppose it is not because I believe there is any chance of getting rid of it or in the near future, but simply because I prefer to live with what I consider an accurate perception of reality. I don't think there's any universe in which Moldbug lives in an accurate perception of reality. We're gonna use hypothetical universes like that. But also remember that democracy is a state of limited civil war. It is always pregnant with the spark of war proper at home and abroad. But so is a monarchy.
What system isn't?
Yeah, I know. I guess Moldbug prefers a limited, non-violent civil war to an actual 30-year civil war. But okay, there we go. It's fairly obvious that in many of the international conflicts of the Universalist era, the two sides have been allied or para-allied with different American political parties, even when the U.S. military is involved in the war. To call this phenomena dangerous would be an understatement, and I'll say more about it shortly. Here we go. I mentioned these two guys already. Two 20th century writers have extensively opposed democracy are Hans Hermann Hoppe and Erich von Kuhn-Ledin. Hoppe is a libertarian and KL was a monarchist. So neither views are exactly the same as mine, but they are both worth reading. Hoppe is probably the most rigorous thinker. KL was a much better writer with a broader, more intuitive feel for history. If you're considering the hard, rocky road of the interdemocratic descent, you should definitely check out their works. Now, again, I don't think this idea originates with these two guys, but I don't know where it does. And that's what I'm trying to figure out, because it's just so contrary to history. Okay, let's see. Before we go on to the next one, is there anything you want to say about what we just read, Logos?
I got a headache thinking about how you're thinking about it, because it seemed more historical screw up, which is more your arena than mine. So sorry, I guess.
That's fine. Conrad reviews Africa Audio, July 27th, 2007. Here, since I prodded him to this, I suppose I should say a few words. Of course, this is a lovely review. What more could one expect? Conrad's choice of screenshots is excellent, revealing the cinematic achievement that is Africa Audio. It is not for the content and the title font. It'd be almost impossible to believe this documentary was made in 1966. Merely as movie makers, Jacopetti and Prosperi, directors of the more famous Mondo films, although they consider Audio their masterpiece, were far ahead of their time. Audio is not merely a movie, however, it is a historical document. And this is where I must fault Conrad slightly, because the problem is he is misleading you a little. It is a very pardonable reviewer's trick. The trouble is that he wants you to watch the movie. The Google video copy has been pulled, but it's easy to find on DVD, and so he makes it sound a little bit like a National Geographic special, and you almost certainly don't want to watch this movie. If there is any good reason for the world to have an MPAA Audio Africa is it. In fact, I don't think an NC-17 would really do audio justice. I think it might as well be something like NC-40. Certainly, if you are between the ages of 33 and 39, there's no chance you will ever forget the experience. Whoops. All right. Let me put it this way. In Audio, you see two men killed on screen. These executions are almost certainly not faked. I don't believe any of that footage is, although clearly some of the events, such as the characteristic megafauna being hunted with spears, are orchestrated rather than incidental. But what is really appalling is that by the point at which you see this, which is toward the end of the film, it hardly bothers you at all. It seems really almost normal. The genius of Audio is that it sweeps you into a welter of stupendous tragedy that was Africa in the 60s, engaging your senses and forcing you beyond any conceivable denial. If you saw Hotel Rwanda or Last King of Scotland, perhaps you got a small taste of this expectation. Both of these were, of course, fiction. For example, audio contains the only footage of actual genocide that I know of, and it's not just footage of genocide, it's 35 millimeter film, shot by one of the leading documentary cinematographers of his generation from a helicopter of a genocide which I had never heard of. The genocide is the murder of Arabs of Zanzibar in 1964. It's briefly mentioned on this page, which gives a death count of 5,000, a number which anyone who sees the film can tell is understated. You see almost that many people on screen, and that's just the roles they used. Murdering 5,000 people barely counts as a genocide these days, and it hardly requires the use of large, prepared, mechanically dug mass graves. My guess is that the memory hole in this case is due to the fact that the Arab ruling class of Zanzibar was generally aligned with the British Empire, and the African party which sponsored the coup and genocide was aligned with Tanzania, which Zanzibar merged with Tanganyika to form 3 months later, and which was a longtime darling of the Western left. Allow me to set the scene. After trying to land in Zanzibar and being forced to make a quick takeoff when their plane is shot at and a companion plane is burned on the landing strip, our filmmakers rent a helicopter in Kenya and fly over the scene at a reasonable height. We see a line of people, dark-skinned men, women, and children in white Arab clothing, walking single file as far as the eye can see toward the aforementioned mass graves. The soldiers guarding them occasionally look up and take a pot shot of the copter, but it's too high. Cut to a shallow tidal flat where hundreds, at least probably thousands of Arabs have been literally driven into the sea. Small boats are collecting a few of them. The rest merely stand around in water up to their ankles, presumably wondering what in the hell to do. There's no answer. The mainland is not in a swimming distance. The next day, the helicopter returns, and where there had been people, there were their bodies, still in the same white robes. Have you ever wondered how, if the NS had invented some miracle wonder weapon in 1944 and actually won the war, they would have explained the Shoah? Because I'm sure there would be a way. Mustache Man never ordered it. It was war. Things happen. It was the Allies' fault for not accepting Jewish refugees. The British and Americans bombed city centers, boiling Germans alive like rats in tunnels. The Soviets did all kinds of crazy, horrible things. All of these and more, I'm sure, would be deployed. But if the NS knew one thing, it was how to distort reality. It's often forgotten that when the Mustache Man wrote The Big Lie, he meant, of course, the lies of others. He, Mustache Man, was debunking their lies, offering truth to the people, because he was projecting, and how better to present his own lie. I mean, isn't that kind of what Moldbug is doing? He's projecting, distorting reality, and telling his own lie.
Basically.
Wow. And so all educated people on the planet today learned that there was something called colonialism, that colonialism was evil, and that its death was a liberation. And when I tell you that in reality, this liberation amounted to an orgy of tyranny and murder, which surely at least competes with the achievements of Stalin, Mustache Man, or Mao, that the transition from colonialism to post-colonialism amounts to a transfer of the third world from one Western faction to another, from Optimate to Brahmin, revelationist to universalist, from indirect rule at the local level to the same with the national level. That it replaced governments whose quality of service was generally indifferent to good with ones whose quality of service was disastrous to mediocre, but whose officials at least have the right skin color. Who are you to believe? Me or every educated person on the planet? Well, hey, what did I just say, Logos? Perhaps I am just like Mustache Man. After all, Unqualified Reservations has basically the same goal as Mein Kampf, to convince the reader that he has been fooled, that the world he thinks he lives in is a simulacrum, a fiction, a faked documentary. True, I don't attribute this disparity to the international ruleless cosmopolitan conspiracy or to any conspiracy at all, but at least Mustache Man's readers knew his real name. And this is why I treasure a film like Africa Audio, because it's 40 years old, and the things it shows happened, and because the men who made it were mad geniuses who could turn some of the world's ugliest history into undeniable beauty, whose work can still command our eyes when no sane man should want to see. Again, believe me, you don't want to watch audio. On the other hand, if you don't believe me, you are free to watch it, at least for now. Anything you want to take out of this jumbled mess, Logos?
Nope.
I think Moldbug just likes to hear his own voice. All right. So we're going to read one more, Samantha Power Rules the World, July 28, 2007, and then see what there is in the chat. Samantha Power is at her latest in the New York Times, informs us professor of the practice of global leadership at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. In other words, you might say power is a professor of power, global power to be exact. One would expect her thinking to be characteristic of the powers that be, which we at UR so fondly call the polygon. And the piece linked above does not disappoint. A Times book reviewer review front pager in the grand old style. It delivers the true universalist goods on how to win the war on terror, without, of course, calling it that. If your views on global affairs are anything like mine, you may need a good colonic cleansing after reading Power's article. I suggest Edward Luttwak's Counterinsurgency Warfare as Military Malpractice in Harper's of all places. It should go without saying that Luttwak is a realist and Power is a priest. Or priestess, I guess. I will simply take Luttwak's point of view for granted. I don't think the debate is even worth discussing, but I still think it's worth reading Power's sermon because it demonstrates so many of the pathologies that fascinate us here at UR. First of all, it's important to note the common denominator of all her policy proposals. Note that every solution Powers proposes involves increasing the importance of the State Department and or increasing the importance of the Defense Department. Presumably, funding is to shift accordingly. Of course, this reflects the fact that the state is universalist, BDH, bastion deep in the polygon, and the revelationist OV enclave of the DoD is its ancient hereditary enemy. With DoD's defeats in Iraq, state smells blood and entertains a vague hope of capturing this pesky varmint alive, the same fate it meted out to the CIA in the 70s. Unless you've been in a cave for the last 5 years, you may have trotted a little at how the scourge of Chile, Iran, Guatemala is now joined at the hip with the state and times. Same agency, different people. But Power, of course, hardly sees herself as a foot soldier in this tawdry bureaucratic melee. Any such thought is itself heretical. She has a philosophy to peddle here, and it's as much a philosophy of power as Machiavelli's. Let's look a little more closely at the case study in Applied Universalism. The thing is, global leadership is exactly what it says it is. It's about ruling the world. Does Samantha Power rule the world? Perhaps the best way to explain is that she and her ilk pretend to rule the world, in both the common and monarchical meanings of the word. Power does not have any real influence over Iran, Syria, Venezuela, Hezbollah, etc. Neither she nor anyone else in Cambridge, New York, or Washington can call Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and tell him what to do. The polygon can't even influence his behavior except perhaps by feeding him. And feeding certainly does not tame a creature of this sort. But the universalist view is that since universalism is universal, everyone in the world can become a universalist. Likewise, if they are not antagonized and constantly beaten and threatened, all these rogue states, liberation movements, etc., will eventually settle down and become part of the New World Order. All humans everywhere will be subject to the polygon. There are no aliens, only citizens who haven't naturalized yet. A key aspect of the polygon's power is its ability to maintain the opinion of its literal constituents. America's voting taxpayers, that things are, in fact, moving in this direction. Any policy that denies this violates the vision and is in direct attack on the polygon. For example, any Iranian policy that says Iran is Iran, that it is and presumably will always be an Islamic republic, that Islam and universalism are two different things, and that the way for the U.S. to deal with Iran is to make the terms of the relationship clear and provide effective disincentives for Iranian transgressions is a serious violation. Because this says that Iran is not a subject of the global leadership of Harvard, that all is not becoming one, that the best interests of the American and Iranian governments and populations may in fact conflict. It says that Samantha Power does not rule the world. I don't think it's a coincidence that no mainstream party or politician in the United States has any such policy on its menu. Power is always hard to let go, even when it's imaginary. The essential assumption of global leadership is that Power and her ilk have no actual enemies. The polygon is so powerful that no reasonable person can oppose it. Thus, anyone who attacks it is either A, insane, B, criminal, or C, enraged by injustice. Well, hold on a second. Now we're 15 years out, and the polygon is tottering off an edge of a cliff in a showdown brewing with China. I mean, the thing is, why would Moldbug assume that this status quo would last? Logos.
I have no idea.
And furthermore, it can't be stopped. Wait a minute, but Logos, who won in Afghanistan?
Exactly. Yep.
Who won in Vietnam?
Yep.
What is this nonsense that you can't stop the polygon? What is this? Because again, Afghanistan had not been a USL yet, but Vietnam was. So there you go. Counterinsurgency theory tells us that all members of groups A, B, and C are easy to reconcile to power of the world order. To deal with A and B, either hospitalize, rehabilitate, as the ex-foreign service blogger New Nationalist puts it, we get a note, or for the very worst case, prosecute and imprison them to deal with C.
Okay, I think he's talking about opposition from within the country, not like from within the country you're trying to take over.
Maybe? Because so far, everything we've been talking about is international. Iran.
I know it's a really jarring transition, but when he means opposing the polygon, he's talking about like opposing the foreign policy as a citizen.
Well, okay, we'll keep reading then. To deal with C, redress any grievances they may have, and make very, very sure you, of course, your evil twins over the DoD, don't create any new ones. Well, no, that has to be international, because he's referring to the Mujahideen that were created in Afghanistan.
That's a good point, then.
Right,
Yeah.
the Department of Defense. And
That's
of course,
a good
he's
point,
referring to the blowback of 9/11, because they created the Islamists in Afghanistan, which then blew back in our direction.
Right.
Obviously, C is the hard part, but if you can do this, it's problema salvado. I mean, no, it's not. Because there's no way to sit atop the world with this power indefinitely.
No.
I don't know why he thinks it is. I mean, I don't know. I've given up trying to figure out Moldbug. It's very difficult for me to avoid this conclusion that when historians 100 years hence look at this kind of thinking, assuming, of course, that there are any historians 100 years hence, their overwhelming impression will be of solipsism and hubris, or possibly hubris and solipsism. It's sometimes hard to tell them apart. Note, for example, that in this hefty article on terrorism, there is no discussion of actual terrorists. Power seems completely uninterested in the actual motivation and organization of these friends we haven't got to know yet. She is similarly uninterested in the actual motivations and organization of unruly teenager states such as Iran. Presumably borrowing a phrase from one of her reviewees, it's a little difficult to imagine her actually thinking the E word. She says the United States must learn to get inside the minds of its enemies. Does she follow this with an actual discussion of the minds of its enemies? Of course not. What this diplomatic chestnut turns out to mean is that our quote-unquote enemies actually see the world in just the same way that we do. Quella coincidence. A Bush administration that had stepped into Iran's shoes might have toned down its inflammatory rhetoric. Indeed, I mean, if there's one thing you've never heard from Iran, it's inflammatory rhetoric. Yeah, but hold on. This is something that we see with neocons as well. Because when we look at like the hardball of international politics, they believe that conflicts, that the incentives that we would respond to as the United States would be exactly the same kind of incentives that, say, China or Iran or Islamists or the Soviet Union or now Russia would respond to. And we see that that's manifestly not the case. The sanctions, they say, well, look, if sanctions were imposed on us, we would react the way that we would want Russia to react. But Russia's not reacting the way we'd want them to react. And then before that, Iraq. So sanctions on Iraq, right? So
it's so funny too, because I've been thinking about this recently, serendipitously enough, right? If somebody imposed the kind of sanctions on us that we imposed on Russia, guarantee you our narrative would immediately be, well, we don't negotiate with terrorists.
Yeah. Yeah, we'd start conscription, probably.
Probably would, yep.
The way power sees the world is about the way a kindergarten teacher sees her charges. For kindergartners, one policy fits all. The way to deal with their tantrum is to let them simmer down and never actually get angry at them. After all, they can't actually harm you. Remember that you're in control, and you will stay that way. Of course, this assumes that there is no group D consisting of reasonable people who are perfectly happy to fight a war to gain the usual booty of war, that is power or at least money. Since no one besides Power and her fellow practitioners of global leadership has or can have any real power, D cannot possibly exist. What? No, D exists right now, Logos.
Yep.
Well, if they did exist, however, one would expect them to adopt the strategy of pretending to be members of Group C. Okay, let's see, who's Group C again? Enraged by injustice. Yeah, okay, I mean, that's what Russia is definitely doing now. China as well, so That's fair enough, I guess. That is, people enraged by injustices they have suffered, redressing these injustices, which are presumably real by at least someone's definition of injustice, involves getting Group D power or at least money. Of course, this dissuades them from trying the same trick again, and it certainly persuades others that the strategy D is no good and not worth messing around with. I wonder if strategy D has ever been tried in the past. I can't imagine. People throw around the word appeasement a lot. In my opinion, it's a mistake to use the word because it now has absurdly negative connotations, and the word was once used seriously by those who promoted it. At the very least, before talking about appeasement, we should understand who the appeasers were and why they thought it was a good idea. The idea of appeasement was very simple. The goal was not to bribe or buy off Mustache Man, but to defeat him. The logic worked like this. First, Herr Mustache Man's speeches are full of rantings about the injustices that were supposedly done to the German people at Versailles. True. Second, Versailles was in fact done to the German people at Versailles. Second, injustices were in fact done to the German people at Versailles. True. Third, Herr Mustache Man is a politician and he derives his power from popular support. True. Fourth, redressing the grievances of the German people will leave Herr Mustache Man with nothing to whine about, so he will fall, and reasonable government will replace him. Not true. Well, not to get into a whole argument about the 30s, but, only some people. For example, the grievances of Poland were not going to be addressed democratically by Poland. And so there were still unaddressed grievances, but that's neither here nor there for this discussion. Statistically, therefore, the logic of appeasement is 75% true. While that is not true enough to be actually true, it tends to be true enough to be convincing, especially to its supporters. This is the thing about how Samantha Power rules the world. The interesting thing, the dog that didn't bark in the night, is that her approach doesn't work at all. To borrow Lutwak's medical metaphor, it is about as effective as bloodletting. The only historical examples I can think of in which it led to peace are those in which the equation has just reduced to surrender. And in many others, notably Palestine, the result has been permanent war. But the grain of truth behind the kindergarten teacher mentality is that the U.S. does indeed have overwhelming military power. Absent some serious changes in U.S. immigration law, the jihadis are not about to conquer North America, and so the bloodletting is just that, bloodletting. It can continue indefinitely. At present, it looks set just to do that. Therefore, Power's proposals are not counterproductive at all. They are, in fact, adaptive. They strengthen the polygon and weaken its real enemies, which are not foreign but domestic. Call me crazy, but I think the whole thing makes perfect sense. So, the one thing I'll say is a lot of these war on terror legislation was meant to control the domestic population. That's 100% true. But what we see, though, especially with the war on terror in the sandbox, is it doesn't really strengthen the polygon, because D, the group that Moldbug said wouldn't exist, now does exist, China and Russia. They haven't been at war for the last 20 years. They don't have a bunch of burned out, shell-shocked, PTSD-addled, suicide watch veterans to worry about. We do. The U.S. does. The West does. So, to use the military term, who has more fresh troops? Looks like 20 years in the sandbox isn't really a recipe for success after all. Logos?
Yep. It's a good point. I mean, one thing that being at war a long time could do, I guess, is filter out those who couldn't, psychologically hack it with those who could. The lifers, so to speak, that are so psychologically primed, I guess, they just can keep doing it forever. And so if we can figure out who those people are and ingratiate them into our special forces and so on and so forth, that could be an advantage for us. But as far as like the general infantry, the frontliners and so on, I mean, that's going to be tough.
Right. Yeah. Well, the other thing too is hardware, right? There's going to be the hardware breakdown. I mean, a lot of the hardware the U.S. uses is very complicated and sophisticated. It takes a long time to build. So if you keep it constantly in deployment, it's going to wear down, and then you're going to have a hard time replacing it.
Oh, they've been replacing it plenty. I mean, that's what so much of our military spending is on. I'm not worried about that so much as I'm worried about our social problems at home, because we're spending all this money on keeping our hardware up to date and whatnot, and everything at home is basically falling apart. So,
Yeah. So I'm looking at some of the stuff here in the comment section. We have Considering Phlebas, who says, I read some Moldbug today and was amused by how shocking the intellectual quality was. Bad, implying. Let's see here. We have Paul Moosefoot. If somehow magically the 401k shareholders could organize their votes and counter whoever owns 9%, I think the limit is 9%. BlackRock might be allowed to let more float as market maker. Same guy, this is a complex area to really understand, but I agree there's a concentrated share of voting power. Anything you want to say on that, Logos?
Nope.
Okay, let's see. This is another guy. Again, Considering Phlebas, I literally thought the exact same thing today, LMAO. The money power created the intellectual class. The Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford, Gates foundations shape academia and research. Mm-hmm. Paul Moosefoot, the wide adoption of ESG after Fink, he's the president of BlackRock, 2018 letter sort of demonstrates he has more sway than the Federal Reserve. Let's see, what else we got? Considering Phlebas, imagine having billions in funds to influence society with and then just sitting on it, doing nothing. That's what Moldbug expects us to believe.
Yeah, I saw that. That was pretty hilarious. It's so true.
That's so true. That's actually really good. Let's see. More Fed stuff. I can ignore that. Let's see. Okay, Venat91182. At some point you ask, what does much of this matter? You are in a one-party state and just keep finding out things are as bad as you think they are. I guess I don't. Wow, it was 448. I don't remember what we were talking about then. Here we go. Photosynthetic Z, POF and Logos, exemplary response videos and diagnosis of the DR. Appreciate your erudite gentlemen. Well, thank you. See, Logos, you have fans.
I have fans.
Let's see. Oh, I got Nathan CJ Hood. Hello. JLM, y'all find the channel The Watson Institute. I have not. Okay. I don't see if it's all particularly relevant. Let's see. More of that. Here we go. Shaw Gawkins 666. I appreciate Todd doing this as it must be done. Well, thank you, and we agree. That's why we're doing it. Oh yeah, and let's not forget. Considering Phlebas brings up the Rhodes Scholarship, that was founded by Cecil Rhodes, of course, imperial corporate magnate. But remember, Logos, the money power doesn't influence what gets taught in schools.
No, the schools influence the factory and not the other way around.
I don't know, man. I don't know. Wow. Okay. Well, that looks like everything in the chat. I don't know. I guess we can do one more. This is short, and then we'll probably wrap it up.
It's just a poem.
Oh, it's a poem. Never mind. We're not doing a poem. Yeah. Well, okay. Well, yeah, everyone. So let's go back from the top. We'll look at Orrin McIntyre. So Orrin McIntyre was able to find an order in the chaos that I'm not able to find yet. The structure that Moldbug gives is patently ridiculous for the reasons that I've already described. Going to Moldbug's work tonight, we're no closer to figuring out what Moldbug's true intentions really are. They're just as conflicted and confused and insane as they've always been. Anything you want to add to sum up tonight's show, Logos?
No, I think I don't know. The only summary I can give on this is what happens when you try to be a right wing reactionary, but you've drunk too much of the libertarian Kool-Aid. You know, you're just not going to be effective.
No, you're not going to be effective. And it also doesn't help. I'll add with one more point. It also doesn't help that you try to act in a world that's a fairy tale figment of your own imagination instead of the real world.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. This is Todd Lewis and Logos from the Prayers of Folly podcast signing off.